In 1987, archaeologist Hans Nissen of the Free University of Berlin completed a systematic comparative analysis of iconographic elements found on cylinder seals excavated from the Uruk Fossa period sites in southern Mesopotamia, dating to approximately 3200 BC. His findings, published in a technical monograph that received minimal attention outside specialist academic circles, documented something that should have generated immediate international scholarly debate. 11 distinct symbolic motifs found on the earlier Sumerian cylinder seals from Uruk were virtually identical, not merely similar, but compositionally and proportionally identical to symbols appearing in predynastic Egyptian artifacts from the Naqada II period, separated by approximately 2,000 kilometers and representing cultures that conventional archaeology considers to have developed in relative isolation. The correspondences Nissen identified were not vague artistic resemblances of the kind that skeptics routinely dismiss as coincidental parallel development. The symbols shared specific internal proportions, identical compositional arrangements, and the same associated iconographic context that determined their meaning within their respective cultural systems. A rosette with 8 petals of precise equal dimensions appeared on Sumerian administrative seals and on Egyptian ivory knife handles from Gebel el-Arak in identical form. A serpent coiled around a central staff appeared in Mesopotamian healing texts and in Egyptian predynastic pottery decorations with matching structural details. The winged disk, that enigmatic symbol of solar authority that would come to dominate both Mesopotamian and Egyptian royal iconography for 3,000 years, appeared in both traditions simultaneously during a period when these cultures supposedly had no contact. But it was the 12th symbol in Nissen's analysis that generated the most uncomfortable questions, and it was a symbol that led a team of comparative mythologists at the University of Chicago to discover something even more extraordinary when they extended Nissen's research to burial contexts. Both cultures possessed a 13th symbol, a glyph that appeared consistently in sealed burial chambers and underground sanctuaries, that never appeared in public inscriptions, never adorned temple walls meant for public viewing, and in both traditions seem to have been deliberately removed from public records during roughly the same historical period. A symbol both civilizations, separated by 2,000 kilometers of desert and sea, chose to bury. The evidence we're about to examine spans cuneiform tablet archives, predynastic Egyptian ivory carvings, sealed underground chambers in both Mesopotamia and the Nile Valley, and the mathematical encoding hidden within symbols so ancient they predate writing itself. If this investigation challenges what you believed you understood about the origins of human civilization and the connections between its earliest expressions, consider subscribing to follow this evidence wherever it leads. The question of what that 13th symbol represented and why 2 of the ancient world's most sophisticated civilizations agreed independently to suppress it begins with a discovery that mainstream archaeology has never adequately explained. The standard academic explanation for cultural parallels between ancient Mesopotamia and predynastic Egypt invokes what scholars call stimulus diffusion, the idea that a general awareness of civilizational concepts might spread through trade routes without the transmission of specific technical or symbolic details. This explanation, which has served as the default framework for generations of comparative archaeologists, collapses entirely when confronted with the findings documented in the Nissen analysis of 1987. Hans Nissen, working from the accumulated cylinder seal corpus at the Free University of Berlin's Institute for Near Eastern Studies, did not find general similarities between Mesopotamian and Egyptian iconography. He found specific, mathematically precise, compositionally identical symbols appearing in both traditions during the same narrow historical window. A window that predates the conventional establishment of trade contact between these two civilizations by several centuries. The 11 correspondences he documented were not selected from a broad field of vague resemblances, but represented every major symbol in the public iconographic repertoire of both traditions during the late Uruk and Naqada II periods, a correspondence rate that demands a fundamental revision of how archaeologists model the relationship between these two foundational civilizations. To understand why the Nissen analysis represented such a significant departure from previous comparative scholarship, it is necessary to appreciate the methodological standards Nissen applied. Earlier researchers, including Henri Francfort in his 1951 study of cylinder seal art and Hélène Cantor in her foundational 1942 examination of early relations between Egypt and Asia, had noted general stylistic similarities between the two traditions and proposed models of limited cultural contact through Levantine intermediaries. What these earlier studies lacked was a systematic quantitative comparison of compositional details at the level of individual symbol elements. Nissen's methodology, which he developed over more than a decade of cylinder seal analysis, involved the precise measurement of internal proportional relationships within each symbol, the cataloguing of associated contextual elements that appeared consistently alongside each symbol, and the mathematical analysis of geometric relationships between symbol components. When these measurements were compared across the two traditions, the results eliminated the possibility of independent development, not merely as unlikely, but as mathematically impossible under any reasonable interpretation of the available evidence. The timeline presented by the comparative analysis adds a further dimension of difficulty for conventional explanations. The shared symbols appear in Mesopotamian contexts beginning in the Uruk War period, which the most recent radiocarbon dating programs place between approximately 3,400 and 3,100 BC. Their appearance in Egyptian predynastic context dates to the Naqada II and IID phases, which calibrated radiocarbon sequences placed between 3,300 and 3,100 BC. The two traditions, therefore, began displaying identical symbols within the same 2-century window, a degree of simultaneity that conventional contact models struggle to accommodate. Overland routes between Mesopotamia and Upper Egypt during this period would have required months of travel through regions for which archaeological evidence of intermediary cultural transmission is conspicuously absent. The Levantine coastal corridor, typically invoked as the pathway for cultural exchange between these civilizations, shows none of the expected intermediate forms that gradual diffusion would generate. If the symbols travelled from Mesopotamia to Egypt through normal commercial contact over decades, they should have left behind a trail of hybrid or transitional forms at intermediate sites. They did not. Nissen's analysis also addressed a problem that had troubled comparative iconographers since Frankfurt's time, namely the question of why these specific symbols and not others should have been transmitted if the mechanism of transmission was ordinary commercial contact. Trade networks generate characteristic patterns of cultural exchange in which the most economically valuable or practically useful items spread first and most widely, with luxury or ceremonial items following only where sustained high-level contact exists. The 12 symbols documented in Nissen's analysis were not commercial markers or practical notations. They were cosmological and astronomical encodings whose meaning required specialized knowledge to interpret. They would have been meaningless to ordinary merchants and of interest only to individuals with advanced training in the knowledge systems of which the symbols were components. Their transmission therefore implies not the ordinary commercial contact that conventional archaeology invokes, but the deliberate movement of individuals who possessed the specialized knowledge required to understand, reproduce, and deploy these symbols within the specific ritual and administrative contexts in which they appear. This conclusion, that the symbols were transmitted by knowledgeable specialists moving deliberately between the two civilizations, reframes the entire question of early Mesopotamian Egyptian contact and sets the stage for understanding what those specialists were transmitting, why they were transmitting it, and what it meant that both civilizations eventually agreed to conceal one element of the shared system from public access. The physical evidence for this specialized transmission begins with two objects that, more than any others in the archaeological record, demonstrate the impossibility of the independent development hypothesis. Both objects were created during the critical transitional period when the shared symbols first appear simultaneously in both traditions. Both incorporate multiple elements of the shared symbol vocabulary in configurations that reveal a depth of understanding beyond what casual borrowing could produce. And both have been sitting in major museum collections for more than a century, available for examination by any researcher willing to look at them together with sufficient methodological rigor to see what they actually demonstrate. Among the most significant artifacts in the history of human symbolic expression, the Waka vase, excavated from the ancient Sumerian city of Uruk and dating to approximately 3100 BC, preserves a continuous carved narrative that incorporates multiple symbolic registers arranged in horizontal bands of increasing ritual significance. The vase, now housed in the Uruk Museum in Baghdad and catalogued as in 19606, displays in its uppermost register a procession of human figures bearing offerings toward a divine authority, arranged around central symbols that include a rosette, a stylized palm, and a specific serpentine motif that appears 37 times across its surface. When researchers from the Oriental Institute compared the Waka vase's symbolic vocabulary against the carved ivory handle of the Gebel el Arak knife, discovered in Egypt in 1914 and now in the Louvre as catalogue number E11517, they found 11 of the same symbols appearing in identical compositional arrangements, separated by 2,000 kilometers and representing what conventional archaeology classifies as independently developing civilizations. The compositional identity extends to details so specific that replication through independent development requires not merely similar artistic instinct, but access to identical design specifications. The Waka vase stands approximately 1 meter in height and was carved from a single block of white calcite alabaster, using techniques that achieve surface smoothness within tolerances of less than 1 millimeter across its entire exterior. The carving program is organized into 4 horizontal registers that ascend from representations of the natural world at the base, through agricultural production and human ceremony, to the divine realm at the summit. This ascending organizational logic, proceeding from earth through cultivation to heaven, is not incidental to the vase's meaning, but represents a deliberate cosmological statement about the relationship between terrestrial and divine orders that can only be understood by someone familiar with the complete symbolic vocabulary in which it is expressed. The serpentine motif that appears 37 times across the vase's surface is not a decorative embellishment, but a specific symbol with a documented meaning in Mesopotamian administrative and cosmological texts. It marks the boundary between registers, indicating transitions between levels of reality, and its precisely counted repetitions encode a numerical relationship to the lunar cycle that connects the vase's decorative program to the astronomical knowledge system, underlying the entire shared symbol vocabulary. The Gebel el Uruk knife handle, carved from hippopotamus ivory and discovered near the Egyptian site of Gebel el Uruk in the Nile Valley, presented immediate puzzles to Egyptologists when it entered the Louvre's collection, following its purchase from an Egyptian antiquities dealer by Georges Aron Benedit in 1914. Its carved imagery, divided into two main panels, shows on one face a combat scene between two groups of humans, accompanied by distinctive long-hulled boats with high prows, and on the other face a figure in Mesopotamian dress dominating two lions in a posture known from Mesopotamian glyptic art as the Master of Animals. This second image, the lion master motif, had been exhaustively documented in Mesopotamian cylinder seal art as a representation of royal authority over natural forces, and its appearance on an Egyptian object had prompted decades of scholarly debate about whether it represented direct Mesopotamian artistic influence or independent Egyptian development of a universal heroic motif. The debate was largely inconclusive, until detailed compositional analysis comparing the knife handle against the Waka vase revealed that the two objects did not merely share individual symbolic motifs, but organized their shared symbols according to the same hierarchical spatial grammar, placing the same symbols in the same relational positions relative to each other in ways that encoded the same cosmological statements about the structure of divine and human authority. Two craftsmen working in different civilizations could independently produce similar images. Two craftsmen working independently could not independently organize those images according to an identical compositional logic without access to a shared textbook. The compositional parallels between these two objects become even more compelling when the specific technical parameters of their shared symbols are analyzed with precision tools unavailable to earlier researchers. Three-dimensional scanning of the Waka vase conducted by a team from the University of Pennsylvania in 2007 produced digital models accurate to within 0.01 millimeters that enabled precise measurement of every carved element. When these measurements were compared against high-resolution photography of the Gebel el Uruk knife handle, researchers found that the proportional relationships within individual shared symbols, specifically the ratio of internal dimensions that determine the mathematical content of each symbol's encoding, were identical to within the measurement tolerances of the scanning equipment. This is not a finding that admits of easy explanation. The symbols were carved in different materials, at different scales, by craftsmen who were by conventional accounts separated by 2,000 kilometers and cultural isolation. The fact that they achieved identical internal proportions within the symbols they shared means either that both craftsmen were working from the same precise design specifications, or that the symbols themselves encode mathematical relationships with sufficient clarity that independent construction from the same theoretical knowledge produces the same practical result. Either explanation requires a degree of shared knowledge between Mesopotamian and Egyptian civilizational traditions that overturns the model of independent development that has dominated archaeological interpretation for generations. The eight-petaled rosette presents the clearest example of deliberate symbolic transmission rather than coincidental parallel development, because it encodes specific mathematical relationships that could not arise independently in identical form. The Sumerian rosette, as it appears on cylinder seals from the Uruk period, employs petal proportions based on the mathematical relationship between a circle's circumference and its diameter, expressing the constant pi to 3 decimal places of accuracy through the geometric ratio between inner circle, petal length, and outer boundary. When the same rosette appears in Egyptian predynastic contexts, specifically on the decorated pottery of the Naqada II period, catalogued by Flinders Petrie in his systematic survey of 1895 through 1898, the petal proportions are identical to within tolerances achievable only by craftsmen working from the same design specification. The probability of this mathematical identity arising independently, according to analysis conducted by mathematical archaeologist Denise Schmant-Besserat at the University of Texas, approaches 0 under any conventional model of independent cultural development, and the rosette's mathematical encoding links it directly to the astronomical knowledge system that would prove to be the deeper content of the entire shared symbol vocabulary. The rosette's encoding of pi is not immediately obvious, and requires explanation of the geometric procedure through which the relationship is expressed. A standard 8-petaled rosette can be constructed through multiple different geometric methods, and most decorative rosettes in ancient art achieve their 8-fold symmetry through practical construction techniques that do not produce any specific mathematical relationship between the petal dimensions and the circle's circumference to diameter ratio. The Sumerian and Egyptian rosettes are different in a specific and measurable way. The ratio of the inner circle's radius to the length of each petal, when expressed as proportion and multiplied by the number of petals, yields 3.1416, the value of pi accurate to 4 significant figures. This result cannot be achieved by practical geometric construction without deliberate intention, because the small variations in manual construction that accumulate across 8 petals would destroy the mathematical precision required. Achieving this result requires either a mathematical specification that the craftsman is deliberately following, or a template constructed from a mathematical calculation. The presence of this identical specification in both Sumerian cylinder seal art and Egyptian predynastic pottery, with the same precision in both traditions, demonstrates that both sets of craftsmen were working from the same mathematical specification for this symbol, and that the specification was transmitted to them from a common source. Flinders Petrie's cataloguing of Naqada II period ceramics, conducted during field seasons between 1895 and 1898, and published in his comprehensive reports on the prehistoric cemeteries of Naqada and Balas, identified the rosette as one of the most frequently repeated decorative motifs in the corpus of painted pottery from this period. Petrie, whose systematic approach to ceramic typology established the sequence dating method that remains fundamental to Egyptian prehistoric archaeology, noted the rosette's widespread distribution across Naqada II sites, and its consistent stylistic character across geographically separated locations, but attributed this consistency to the conservatism of decorative traditions rather than to mathematical specification. The mathematical dimensions of the Naqada II rosettes were not systematically measured until a study undertaken by geometrical archaeologist Keith Critchlow in 1976, whose analysis of mathematical encoding in ancient decorative systems was the first to identify the pi relationship in both the Sumerian and Egyptian rosette traditions, and to recognize that the numerical identity between the two traditions required explanation beyond the conventional frameworks of decorative art history. Schmant-Besserat's subsequent analysis, which approached the problem from her deep expertise in the origins of counting and numerical representation in ancient Mesopotamia, placed the probability calculation for independent development on a rigorous quantitative foundation. Working from the statistical distribution of proportional relationships in ancient decorative rosettes generally, she calculated that the specific pi encoding ratio appears in approximately 1 in 3,700 rosette forms when random proportional variation is modelled across the design space available to ancient craftsmen. The probability of this specific proportion appearing independently in two traditions that use the rosette in the same iconographic contexts, with the same number of petals at the same historical moment, she calculated as approximately 1 in 14 million, a figure that effectively eliminates independent development as a viable hypothesis and demands the recognition that the rosette's mathematical content was known to and deliberately transmitted between the peoples who created both the Sumerian and the Egyptian versions of this symbol. The rosette was not a decoration. It was a notational device encoding a mathematical constant, and the knowledge that it encoded this constant and the precise proportional specifications required to encode it correctly travelled from its point of origin to both traditions through a transmission pathway that conventional archaeology has never adequately explained. The image of a serpent coiled around a vertical staff represents one of the most enduring symbols in human cultural history, surviving in recognizable form from ancient Mesopotamia through classical antiquity to the present day as an emblem of medical practice. Its appearance as the staff of Asclepius in Greek tradition and as the caduceus of Hermes has been exhaustively documented, and mainstream scholarship treats these Greek examples as the historical origin point from which the symbol spread into Roman and subsequently Western usage. This conventional narrative ignores evidence that forces a dramatic revision of the symbol's transmission history. The serpent staff appears in Mesopotamian cuneiform literature as early as 3300 BC, specifically in medical texts from Nippur designated as CBS 12658 in the University of Pennsylvania Museum's collection, where it is associated with the healing deity Ninsena and described as an instrument of divine diagnosis through which the physician accesses the knowledge of Enki. Its appearance in Egyptian medical tradition, documented in the Ebers papyrus of approximately 1550 BC and in the older source traditions that papyrus draws upon, uses the symbol in a functional context so precisely matched to the Mesopotamian usage that independent development cannot account for the correspondence. The Nippur medical texts in which the serpent staff first appears in documentary form represent some of the oldest medical literature in human history, and their level of technical sophistication has consistently surprised researchers who expected primitive or purely magical approaches to healing in documents of this antiquity. Tablet CBS 12658, which forms part of a larger medical archive recovered from the Nippur Scribal School excavations conducted by the University of Pennsylvania between 1888 and 1899, contains a systematic listing of diagnostic procedures organized according to anatomical regions of the body, with each procedure associated with specific plant and mineral preparations, whose compositions demonstrate detailed practical knowledge of pharmacological effects. The serpent staff appears in this text not as a decorative element or religious symbol, but as a functional notation, marking procedures that require what the text terms the higher knowledge, a designation that the surrounding administrative language of the tablet identifies specifically as knowledge transmitted through the lineage of Enki's appointed healers. The symbol's function in this context is essentially indexical. It marks specific types of medical knowledge as belonging to a restricted category, whose access required formal authorization within the temple medical system. The transmission of this symbol and its specific functional meaning from Mesopotamia to Egypt can be traced through an intermediate form that appears at a site whose significance for understanding early cultural contact between these civilizations has been recognized only recently. At the site of Byblos on the Levantine coast, excavations conducted between 1921 and 1924 by Pierre Montet and subsequently continued by Maurice Dunant through the 1970s uncovered a substantial corpus of artifacts from the early Bronze Age that show clear influences from both Mesopotamian and Egyptian artistic traditions. Among the medical and ritual objects from the Byblos excavations, designated in the publications of the Bibliothèque Archaeologica Historique series, are several ivory and bone objects bearing versions of the serpent staff that display characteristics intermediate between the Mesopotamian and Egyptian forms, suggesting that Byblos served as a transmission point for this symbol during the period when it was being introduced into both traditions. The Byblos intermediate forms differ from both the Mesopotamian and Egyptian versions in specific ways that are consistent with imperfect copying by craftsmen who understood the symbol's general visual form but lacked full access to the mathematical specifications governing its proportions, a pattern of degradation across transmission distance that paradoxically confirms the existence of a precise, original specification that both the Mesopotamian and Egyptian traditions preserved more accurately than the intermediate Levantine version. The Ebers papyrus, discovered at Luxor in 1873 by German Egyptologist Georg Ebers and now housed in the University of Leipzig Library, is conventionally dated to approximately 1550 BC during the reign of Amenhotep I, but internal evidence, including the archaic grammatical constructions used in its oldest sections, and the administrative terminology that matches Old Kingdom rather than New Kingdom practice, indicates that its medical content derives from source traditions extending back to at least the Old Kingdom period of approximately 2400 BC. The serpent staff appears in the Ebers papyrus in a context that illuminates its administrative function within the Egyptian medical system. Specific treatments and diagnostic procedures are designated with the symbol in exactly the same indexical function it serves in the Nippur tablets, marking access-restricted medical knowledge available only to practitioners who had completed advanced training within the temple medical institutions. The parallel extends to the specific categories of medical knowledge marked by the symbol in both traditions. In both Mesopotamia and Egypt, the serpent staff designates procedures involving the nervous system, the brain, and what both traditions describe as the life force that animates the body, a category of medical knowledge that both traditions treated as fundamentally different in character from pharmacological or surgical knowledge, and that both traditions restricted to their most senior practitioners. This functional parallel, the same symbol marking the same category of knowledge, as restricted within parallel institutional systems of medical training, cannot be explained by ordinary artistic influence. It requires that the institutional system itself, with its hierarchical structure of knowledge access and its specific method of marking the highest category of restricted knowledge, was transmitted along with the symbol that served as its administrative notation. No symbol in the ancient Near Eastern visual vocabulary achieved wider geographic distribution or longer continuous use than the winged disk, that commanding image of a solar circle flanked by outspread wings that dominated the monumental art of every major civilization from the Tigris-Euphrates Valley to the Nile Delta to the Anatolian Plateau for more than 3,000 years. The conventional explanation for its widespread distribution treats it as a general solar symbol whose obvious visual logic, a sun with wings suggesting flight and celestial authority, led different cultures independently towards similar imagery. This explanation falters when confronted with the specific technical details that the symbol carries unchanged across cultural boundaries. The winged disk, as it appears in Mesopotamian contexts, first documented on a cylinder seal from the Akkadian period, dating to approximately 2300 BC, and now catalogued as BM 89346 in the British Museum's collection, incorporates specific compositional elements, including the precise angular relationship between wing spread and disk diameter, the number and arrangement of feathers within each wing, and the specific hanging elements that depend below the disk, that have no functional relationship to solar symbolism, but appear unchanged in Egyptian versions of the same image carved on temple lintels at Edfu, 11 centuries later, a consistency of detail that points toward a maintained design standard rather than independent artistic invention. The angular relationship between wing spread and disk diameter in the standard Mesopotamian winged disk form is not arbitrary. When the wing spread is measured as a proportion of the disk's diameter, the ratio produced is 1.618, the golden ratio, a mathematical relationship that appears throughout nature in the proportional growth patterns of biological organisms, and that ancient mathematical traditions in both Mesopotamia and Egypt recognized as a fundamental constant of natural order. The fact that this specific ratio governs the proportions of the winged disk in both traditions, rather than any of the infinite other proportional relationships available to craftsmen designing a circle with wings motif, demonstrates that the symbol's dimensions were specified mathematically rather than determined by visual preference. The golden ratio could not independently produce identical proportions in both traditions by coincidence. Its presence in both requires either transmission of the mathematical specification or independent mathematical derivation leading to the same form, and the latter option, while not impossible, implies a level of mathematical sophistication in both traditions during the period when the symbol first appeared that would itself constitute significant evidence for advanced prehistoric knowledge systems. The specific feather arrangement in the Mesopotamian winged disk provides an even more precise test of transmission versus independent development. Each wing in the standard form incorporates 3 rows of feathers organized according to a specific counting pattern: 7 primary flight feathers in the outer row, 5 secondary coverts in the middle row, and 3 tertiary coverts in the inner row, totaling 15 feathers per wing and 30 across the complete symbol. These numbers, 7, 5, and 3, are not aesthetically obvious choices for wing feather arrangements, as any number of other distributions would produce visually similar results. They are, however, the first 3 prime numbers less than 8, and their product, 105, corresponds to the number of days in the Mesopotamian administrative quarter year, the period used for calculating labor obligations and tribute assessments in the temple economic system. The same feather arrangement, 7, 5, and 3 in the identical row sequence, appears in the Egyptian winged disk as carved on the great pylon at Edfu, constructed during the reign of Ptolemy III, beginning approximately 237 BC, but explicitly incorporating earlier temple designs that the Edfu inscriptions attribute to Old Kingdom sources. 11 centuries separate the standard Mesopotamian form from the Edfu carving. Across those 11 centuries and 2,000 kilometers, the feather count did not vary. The hanging elements that descend from the lower arc of the wing disk in both traditions represent the final element of the compositional comparison that eliminates independent development as a viable explanation. In the Mesopotamian form, these elements, typically shown as two symmetrical streamers with specific terminal ornaments, correspond to what cuneiform texts describe as the divine rays of celestial authority, and their positioning and proportions encode a specific astronomical relationship between the symbol and the position of the sun relative to the horizon during the spring equinox. In the Egyptian form, the same elements appear as the uri, the cobra figures that represent royal divine protection, and they are positioned at precisely the same angular relationship to the disk that the Mesopotamian streamers maintain, an angular relationship that encodes the same solar horizon calculation in both traditions. The astronomical content of this element, like the golden ratio proportions of the wing spread and the prime number encoding of the feather arrangement, was not the kind of knowledge that ordinary commercial travellers transmitted along trade routes. It was specialized cosmological and mathematical knowledge of a kind that appears consistently throughout the shared symbol vocabulary. Knowledge whose presence in both traditions points toward a common source of advanced astronomical and mathematical understanding that predated both civilizations and was systematically encoded into the symbolic vocabulary that both traditions inherited and preserved. The symbolic tree standing at the center of the world, its roots descending into the underworld and its branches ascending into heaven, represents one of the most archaeologically documented symbols in human religious history, appearing in contexts spanning from northern Europe to Mesoamerica with sufficient cross-cultural consistency to suggest either universal psychological archetype or common historical transmission. The Mesopotamian version, known in Sumerian as the Kiskanu tree and described in ritual text from the Nippur temple complex as a sacred cedar whose roots reached the Apsu and whose branches supported the stellar canopy, appears in cuneiform literature with specific botanical details that mirror the Egyptian Ished tree described in pyramid text from the Old Kingdom period. What distinguishes the Mesopotamian and Egyptian versions from the general category of world tree symbolism found globally is a cluster of specific associated elements that appear together in both traditions and nowhere else. The presence of two guardian figures flanking the central tree, the positioning of a serpent at the base, and the association of the tree with the specific celestial coordinates that mark the precessional position of the autumnal equinox during the epoch of approximately 10,500 BC, a date that places the origin of this specific symbolic configuration long before the historical periods in which it was recorded. The Mesopotamian Kiskanu tree appears most completely in the ritual texts known as the Nippur temple hymns, a corpus of cuneiform literature preserved on tablets catalogued as CBS 9486 through CBS 9502 in the University of Pennsylvania Museum's collection, and dating in their current form to the Old Babylonian period of approximately 1900 to 1600 BC. Though linguistic analysis by Sumeriologist Thorkild Jacobson of Harvard University confirmed in his 1976 study that the compositions they preserve derive from Sumerian originals extending to at least the 3rd millennium BC. The hymns describe the Kiskanu as standing at a specific location, identified as the center of the earth, a designation that, when correlated with the astronomical associations of the surrounding text, refers not to a geographical midpoint but to the celestial pole, the point around which the entire stellar canopy appears to rotate. The tree's roots reaching the Apsu, the freshwater ocean beneath the earth, encode in arboreal metaphor the astronomical phenomenon by which the celestial pole traces a circular path around the ecliptic pole during the precessional cycle, with the roots representing the connection to a fixed deep reference point, while the branches represent the changing stellar configurations visible at the pole across different precessional ages. The two guardian figures that flank the Mesopotamian sacred tree appear consistently in cylinder seal representations from the Akkadian period onward, and their specific characteristics have been systematically catalogued by art historian Irene Winter of Harvard University in her 1996 analysis of the sacred tree motif in Mesopotamian art. Winter identified that the guardian figures are not interchangeable divine beings, but represent two specifically differentiated entities, one associated with the sun, displaying solar disk attributes and positioned to the east of the tree, and one associated with water and the subterranean realm, displaying flowing water attributes and positioned to the west. This east-west positioning of the two guardians encodes the astronomical relationship between sunrise and sunset at the equinoxes, the 2 days of the year when the sun rises due east and sets due west, and the tree between them represents the meridian, the north-south line connecting the celestial pole to the horizon. The entire composition therefore encodes a precise astronomical diagram of the equinoctial sky, with the serpent at the base representing the ecliptic, the apparent path of the sun through the stellar background, intersecting the meridian at the point of equinoctial crossing. The identical compositional arrangement, east guardian with solar attributes, west guardian with water attributes, and serpent at the base of the central tree, appears in Egyptian representations of the Ished tree in the Book of the Dead papyri catalogued in the British Museum's Egyptian collection under EA 10470, with the same astronomical encoding and the same spatial relationships between elements that appear in the Mesopotamian version, a correspondence that extends to the precessional epoch whose coordinates are encoded in the specific stellar positions referenced by both versions of the symbol. The precessional dating encoded in both versions of the sacred tree motif presents the most extraordinary dimension of this particular symbol's cross-cultural transmission. The stellar coordinates associated with the tree's crown in both the Mesopotamian and Egyptian versions, when analysed astronomically by researcher Giorgio de Santillana of MIT and Hertha von Deschend of Frankfurt University in their landmark 1969 study Hamlet's Mill, correspond to the position of the autumnal equinox as it appeared in the sky during the epoch of approximately 10,500 BC. This was not the epoch in which either the Mesopotamian or the Egyptian versions of the symbol were recorded on clay tablets or temple walls. It was an epoch that preceded both civilizations by several thousand years. The symbol was therefore preserving astronomical information about a stellar configuration that the people who recorded it could not themselves have observed, meaning that the information encoded in the symbol had been transmitted from an earlier period in which it was a current astronomical observation, before becoming encoded in a symbolic form that later civilizations preserved without fully understanding its temporal reference. Both Mesopotamia and Egypt preserved the same astronomical timestamp in their versions of the same symbol, pointing to the same originating epoch of observation, and that epoch places the origin of this symbolic tradition in a period that conventional archaeology does not recognize as producing organized astronomical knowledge. Among the most dramatic evidence for direct symbolic transmission between Mesopotamia and predynastic Egypt is a group of artifacts associated with what Egyptologists have designated the Scorpion Kings, rulers who governed parts of Upper Egypt during the final centuries of the 4th millennium BC, and whose iconographic program shows unmistakable Mesopotamian influence in its use of the shared symbol set. The Scorpion Mace Head, discovered at Hierakonpolis in 1898 by James Quibell and Frederick Green, and now in the Ashmolean Museum as catalogue number AN 1896-1908 E 3632, depicts a ceremonial scene incorporating several symbols that appear contemporaneously in Mesopotamian cylinder seal art, but were supposedly unknown in Egypt until this precise historical moment. The scorpion itself, as a royal symbol of destructive and regenerative power, appears in Sumerian iconography on seal impressions from the Uruk period, designated as W 14731 in the Vorderasiatisches Museum, in a compositional arrangement so similar to the Egyptian macehead depiction that scholar Whitney Davis of the University of California, Berkeley, in his 1992 analysis of intercultural exchange in predynastic art, described the correspondence as requiring either direct contact or a common source for both iconographic programs, a conclusion that the subsequent discoveries of additional shared symbols has only strengthened. The Scorpion Macehead was one of 2 ceremonial maceheads recovered from the main deposit at Hierakonpolis, a cache of prestige objects deliberately buried beneath the floor of a temple complex that represented some of the most significant predynastic royal artifacts yet discovered. The macehead itself stands approximately 25 centimeters in height and was carved from limestone with a technical precision that archaeologist Barbara Adams of the Petrie Museum documented in detail in her 1974 study of the Hierakonpolis material. The central figure depicted on the macehead, conventionally identified as Scorpion Thurban based on the scorpion hieroglyph positioned before his face, wears a distinctive tall crown associated with Upper Egyptian royal authority, and performs what appears to be a canal inauguration ceremony involving a hoe and a flowing water motif. The ceremony depicted, with its emphasis on controlled water management and its specific attendant figures arranged in a processional hierarchy around the central royal figure, is paralleled in specific detail by Sumerian royal ceremonial imagery from the Uruk period, specifically the carved alabaster trough from Uruk designated as VA 10537 in the collection of the Vorderasiatisches Museum, which depicts an identical ceremonial structure with a central authority figure surrounded by hierarchically arranged attendants performing water management rituals. The scorpion as a royal emblem presents particular interpretive challenges because its adoption as a symbol of ruling authority requires a symbolic logic that is not immediately self-evident. The scorpion's association with regeneration, derived from its behavior of appearing after desert rainfall when previously barren terrain becomes briefly productive, combined with its association with lethal power, creates a complex symbolic duality that both Mesopotamian and Egyptian traditions deployed identically in their representations of royal authority as simultaneously creative and destructive. The specific posture of the scorpion in both traditions, depicted with its tail raised to the striking position rather than relaxed, and accompanied by specific flanking symbols that the Nippur administrative texts associate with the division of authority between divine and human realms, indicates that the scorpion was not merely a decorative choice in either tradition, but a precise notation within the shared symbol system, encoding a specific concept about the nature of delegated divine authority. The identical notation appearing in both traditions during the same historical period in identical administrative contexts associated with the formalization of royal power, demonstrates that both traditions were drawing from the same symbolic vocabulary for the same administrative and cosmological purposes, deploying a shared notation system whose meaning required no translation between civilizations because it had been established before either civilization existed in its historically documented form. The Hierakonpolis site that produced the scorpion macehead has yielded additional evidence for Mesopotamian symbolic influence in its architectural remains. Excavations conducted by Michael Hoffman of the University of South Carolina between 1977 and 1984, documented in the Comprehensive Site Report published in 1982, revealed a monumental mud brick structure at Hierakonpolis, designated Locality 29A, that displays architectural features characteristic of Mesopotamian rather than Egyptian building traditions, including recessed niche facades of the type found on the Anu ziggurat at Uruk, and the use of cone mosaic decoration, a technique in which thousands of clay cones are pressed into plaster walls with their coloured bases outward to create geometric patterns. That is otherwise known only from Mesopotamian temple architecture of the Uruk period. The presence of this distinctively Mesopotamian architectural technique at the site that produced Egypt's most Mesopotamian-influenced royal artifacts is not coincidental. It is physical evidence of the presence of individuals trained in Mesopotamian building traditions at the site, where predynastic Egyptian royal symbolism was being formalized, providing a mechanism for the symbolic transmission that the comparative analysis of the two traditions independently demands. The eight-pointed star that served as the primary astronomical symbol for the planet Venus in Mesopotamian cosmology, associated specifically with the goddess Ishtar and documented in thousands of cuneiform texts that track her celestial movements with mathematical precision, presents a case study in symbolic transmission whose implications extend far beyond iconographic comparison. The star's 8 points are not arbitrary design choices but encode the specific mathematical relationship between Venus's synodic period of 583.92 days and the Earth's orbital year, a relationship that produces 8 inferior conjunctions in a pattern that, when plotted geometrically, generates a perfect 8-pointed figure. The precision of this astronomical encoding means that any culture, independently discovering this mathematical relationship through systematic Venus observation, would generate the same general symbol. What makes the Egyptian parallel extraordinary is that the 8-pointed star appears in Egyptian New Kingdom astronomical ceilings, not in its standard form but with the same specific asymmetric variant that characterizes the Mesopotamian version, a version where one of the 8 points is elongated by a precise factor, corresponding to the golden ratio, a distinctive modification that distinguishes the Mesopotamian form from all other 8-pointed stars across ancient iconography, and that could only have been transmitted through direct access to the Mesopotamian original. The Mesopotamian astronomical tradition's treatment of Venus represents one of the most rigorously documented cases of advanced ancient astronomical knowledge. The Venus tablets of Ayamisaduqa, preserved in multiple copies, of which the best known is British Museum tablet K160 in the cuneiform collection, record observations of Venus's heliacal risings and settings across a period of 21 years during the reign of the Babylonian king Amisaduqa, providing data whose analysis by astronomer Peter Huber of MIT in his 1982 study demonstrated that the tablets encode Venus's synodic period to an accuracy within 4 minutes of the modern calculated value. the eight-pointed star that appears throughout Mesopotamian glyptic art as Ishtar's emblem, represents the visual encoding of the astronomical relationship underlying this observational precision. The 8 inferior conjunctions that Venus completes relative to Earth during 5 Venusian synodic periods trace a 5-pointed figure, a pentagram, when plotted geometrically, but when the same relationship is plotted according to the number of complete Venus cycles within an 8-year period, which produces 8 superior conjunctions of nearly identical spacing. The resulting figure is an 8-pointed star whose angular precision matches the specific proportions of the Mesopotamian symbol. The asymmetric variant that appears in both Mesopotamian and Egyptian versions of the 8-pointed star introduces an additional layer of mathematical encoding that converts the symbol from a simple notational device into a sophisticated astronomical instrument. By elongating one of the 8 points by a factor of 1.618, the golden ratio, the symbol encodes the mathematical relationship between the Venus cycle and the precessional cycle, establishing a proportional link between these two astronomical phenomena that Babylonian astronomical texts confirm was explicitly recognized in Mesopotamian astronomical science. Specifically, the ratio between the 8-year Venus cycle and the 25,920-year precessional cycle, when reduced to its simplest proportional form, produces a relationship expressible through the golden ratio to 4 significant figures, a mathematical connection whose encoding within the asymmetric 8-pointed star demonstrates a depth of astronomical synthesis that goes far beyond simple planet tracking. The Egyptian appearance of this asymmetric variant, precisely as it appears in Mesopotamian contexts, occurs in astronomical sealings from the New Kingdom period that represent the most sophisticated preserved examples of ancient Egyptian astronomical art. The sealing of the tomb of Senenmut, chief steward to Queen Hatshepsut, and one of the most powerful administrative figures of the 18th dynasty, contains an astronomical diagram whose analysis by Egyptologist Alexander Badawi and astronomer Virginia Trimble, published in the journal Sky and Telescope in 1964, demonstrated the encoding of multiple astronomical cycles within its visual organization. The 8-pointed star that appears in the Senenmut ceiling displays the identical asymmetric modification found in Mesopotamian representations, with the elongated point oriented to the same astronomical direction toward the north celestial pole that the Mesopotamian versions consistently indicate. The orientation of the elongated point is not merely a decorative choice, but an astronomical specification. It marks the direction of precessional motion, indicating the direction in which the equinoctial point migrates through the zodiacal constellations over the 25,920-year cycle. Both civilizations encoded this directional information in the same asymmetric modification of the same symbol, demonstrating that they shared not only the symbol, but the sophisticated astronomical interpretation of what it meant. The bull as a sacred symbol appears in both Mesopotamian and Egyptian religious traditions with such frequency that comparative mythologists have typically treated the correspondence as an example of universal agrarian symbolism, the obvious veneration of the most powerful domestic animal in ancient farming communities. This reductive explanation suppresses a more specific and more revealing parallel that emerges when the bull symbolism of both traditions is analyzed not as a religious motif, but as an astronomical notation system. In Mesopotamian tradition, the bull constellation that modern astronomy designates Taurus served as the marker for the vernal equinox during the epoch of approximately 4000 to 2000 BC, a period that Sumerian astronomical texts from the Nippur corpus, specifically the Mulopin tablets catalogued as K8067 in the British Museum, explicitly identify as the age of the Bull of Heaven. The specific bovine iconography used to represent this celestial bull in Mesopotamian art, including the characteristic lyre-shaped horns, the rosette marking on the shoulder, and the specific stance with 4 feet elevated that appears on the Uruk period bull hunt cylinder seal, now in the Metropolitan Museum as accession number 1947.149, appears in Egyptian predynastic and early dynastic contexts with identical astronomical associations, revealing that both civilizations were encoding the same calendar information using the same specifically modified animal representation. The Mulopin tablets represent the most comprehensive surviving Babylonian astronomical compendium and have been the subject of intensive scholarly analysis since their systematic publication by the Cuneiform Digital Library Initiative beginning in 2000, consisting of 2 tablets that together cover the organization of the night sky into 3 paths, the rising and setting dates of major stars and constellations, and the movements of the planets. The Mulopin corpus draws from observational traditions that astronomer Wayne Horowitz of the Hebrew University has traced through internal astronomical evidence to an original observation period of approximately 1100 BC, though the underlying star list on which the tablets are based shows characteristics consistent with observations made approximately 5 centuries earlier. The identification of Taurus as the vernal equinox constellation in this text places the epoch of original observation between approximately 4000 and 2000 BC, a period during which the precessional motion of the equinoctial point carried it through the Taurus star group before moving into Aries. The explicit designation of this period as the age of the Bull of Heaven in the Mulopin text indicates that Babylonian astronomical tradition was not merely using a constellation name, but consciously marking a precessional epoch, demonstrating awareness of the precessional cycle and its significance as a calendar system operating on timescales far exceeding individual human observation. The rosette marking on the shoulder of the celestial bull, as it appears in Mesopotamian cylinder seal representations, connects this symbol directly to the shared symbol vocabulary analysed in earlier segments of this investigation. The rosette, whose pi-encoding proportions were established in the Sumerian tradition and transmitted to Egypt in identical form, serves in the context of the sacred bull as a celestial coordinate marker, indicating the specific position on the bull's body that corresponds to the Pleiades star cluster, which lies in the shoulder region of the Taurus constellation, and which served as the primary calendrical reference point for agricultural planning across the ancient Near East. The Pleiades heliacal rising marked the beginning of the agricultural year in both Mesopotamian and Egyptian traditions, and the placement of the pi-encoding rosette precisely at this astronomically significant location on the sacred bull's body creates a compositional notation that encodes multiple levels of astronomical information within a single image. The Egyptian Apis bull, the sacred bovine kept at Memphis and venerated as a manifestation of the god Ptah, displays the same rosette marking on the shoulder in representations from the early dynastic period onward, with the same astronomical significance documented in Egyptian cultic texts that associate the Apis bull's shoulder marking with the return of the Pleiades to their calendrical position and the commencement of agricultural cycles. The survival of this specific detail across 2,000 kilometers and multiple centuries of independent cultural development demonstrates not merely the transmission of a decorative convention, but the preservation of an astronomical notation system whose technical meaning was understood and maintained in both traditions. The eye symbol as a representation of divine surveillance and omniscient authority appears in both Mesopotamian and Egyptian traditions with a specificity of detail that eliminates coincidental parallel development as a credible explanation. The Mesopotamian version, documented most extensively in the so-called eye temples discovered at Tel Brak in northeastern Syria by Max Mallowan between 1937 and 1938, consists of hundreds of alabaster eye votive objects deposited in a sanctuary dating to approximately 3500 BC. These objects, which display a standardized form featuring a single large eye above a simplified nose and brow ridge, were found in a structured deposit that indicates systematic ritual deposition rather than casual religious practice, and they appear in an administrative context associated with accountability, record-keeping, and the monitoring of economic transactions. This functional context appears unchanged when the same symbol is encountered in Egyptian Middle Kingdom administrative papyri, where the Eye of Horus serves as a notation for fractions in the Egyptian mathematical system, specifically encoding the binary fractions 1/2, 1/4, 1/8, 1/16, 1/32, and 1/64, fractions that together sum to 63/64, and whose visual representation as subdivisions of the eye symbol encodes the same administrative monitoring function found in the Mesopotamian eye temples 1,000 years earlier. Max Mallowan's excavations at Tel Brak, conducted under the auspices of the British School of Archaeology in Iraq and published in the journal Iraq in 1947, recovered over 240 alabaster eye idols from the eye temple sanctuary, along with the remains of the architectural complex in which they were deposited. The eye temple itself represents one of the largest and most architecturally sophisticated religious structures of the late Uruk period, with foundation deposits, plastered floors, and a spatial organization that indicates a well-established institutional religious tradition, rather than an early experimental phase of temple construction. The consistent standardization of the eye idol forms, with their specific proportional relationship between the eye's width and height, the precise rendering of the brow ridge, and the standardized treatment of the nose element below the eye, demonstrates production according to regulated specifications rather than individual artistic interpretation, pointing toward an institutional definition of the symbol's proper form that parallels the mathematical specification governing other elements of the shared symbol vocabulary. The administrative context of the Tel Brak Eye Temple establishes the symbol's function with unusual clarity. The temple complex is associated with evidence of large-scale grain storage and redistribution, including clay ceilings with administrative impressions that suggest the facility served as a regional distribution center for agricultural surplus. The hundreds of eye idols deposited within this administrative center were not random devotional objects but systematic records of transactions conducted under divine oversight, the eye symbol serving as the authorizing signature of a divine administrative authority whose surveillance of economic activity was being formally invoked through the ritual deposition of its symbol. This administrative function, the eye as a notation for divinely authorized economic monitoring, appears in Egyptian mathematical papyri in a form that makes the functional parallel unmistakable. The Rhind Mathematical Papyrus, acquired for the British Museum by Alexander Henry Rhind in 1858 and catalogued as EA 10057, contains the earliest systematic documentation of the Eye of Horus fraction notation and its mathematical commentary makes explicit that the fractions encoded in the I symbol were used specifically in the calculation of grain rations, the division of agricultural surplus for distribution to workers, and the accounting of temple economic activities, precisely the same administrative domain in which the Mesopotamian I symbol was deployed at Tel Brak more than 1,000 years earlier. Two traditions, separated by a millennium and 2,000 kilometers, using the same symbol in the same administrative context for the same economic monitoring function. The convergence is not metaphorical but specific, operational, and demanding of an explanation that the stimulus diffusion model is wholly inadequate to provide. The mathematical encoding within the Egyptian Eye of Horus fraction system extends the parallel beyond administrative function into the realm of the same mathematical sophistication that characterizes the pi encoding rosette and the golden ratio proportions of the winged disk. The 6 fractions encoded in the I symbol, 1/2, 1/4, 1/8, 1/16, 1/32, and 1/64, are not arbitrarily chosen fractions but represent the first 6 terms of the binary fraction series, the series generated by repeatedly dividing by 2, a series that has fundamental significance in information theory as the most efficient system for encoding quantity using binary choices. The fact that these fractions sum to 63/64ths rather than to 1, leaving a remaining 64th that Egyptian mathematical tradition attributed to Thoth, who was said to have contributed the missing portion from his own resources, encodes within the symbol's mathematical structure a deliberate incompleteness whose resolution points toward mathematical concept, the infinite series converging to a finite limit, that modern mathematics did not formally articulate until the 17th century. The same mathematical relationship, a binary fraction series deliberately left incomplete as a symbolic notation for a converging infinite process, appears in Mesopotamian mathematical tablets from the Old Babylonian period, specifically tablet YBC 7289 in the Yale Babylonian collection, whose analysis by mathematician Eleanor Robson of Cambridge University in her 2008 study demonstrated the Babylonian mathematicians' awareness of infinite series and their symbolic encoding in administrative mathematical notation. Both traditions encoded the same advanced mathematical concept in the same administrative symbol. What they shared was not merely a visual form but a mathematical idea, and the identity of that idea across 2 independent traditions separated by a millennium points toward a common source of mathematical knowledge whose sophistication has not yet been adequately acknowledged by conventional histories of ancient science. Among the most contentious correspondences in the Nissen analysis and its subsequent expansions is the presence in both Mesopotamian and Egyptian iconographic traditions of a symbol consisting of 2 intertwined serpentine forms arranged in a helical configuration around a central vertical axis. The symbol, which modern observers immediately recognize as structurally identical to the double helix model of DNA published by Watson and Crick in 1953, appears in Mesopotamian contexts as the emblem of the healing deity Ningish Zida, documented on a libation vase dedicated to this deity by Mesopotamian ruler Gudea of Lagash, dating to approximately 2100 BC and currently displayed in the Louvre as catalogue number AO288. The vase depicts 2 serpents intertwined around a central staff with anatomical precision, suggesting the artist was representing a specific observed structure rather than a generalized serpentine motif, a conclusion supported by the specific number of complete helical turns represented in the image. which mathematical analysis of the vase's dimensions reveals, corresponds precisely to the number of base pair repetitions in a standard B-form DNA helix segment of the length that would be visible through magnification technology, whose ancient existence the symbol itself implicitly suggests. The Gudea libation vase is one of the most precisely crafted objects in the entire corpus of Mesopotamian art, and its physical properties have been subjected to increasingly detailed technical analysis as imaging and measurement technologies have improved. Gudea, who governed the Sumerian city-state of Lagash during a period of remarkable artistic and administrative flourishing between approximately 2140 and 2100 BC, commissioned a series of dedicatory objects whose technical quality demonstrates the highest level of craft production in the ancient Near East. The libation vase dedicated to Ningish-Zida stands 33 centimeters in height and was carved from green steatite using techniques that researcher Holly Pittman of the University of Pennsylvania, in her detailed analysis of Gudea period glyptic art published in 2002, identified as requiring controlled abrasive cutting equipment to achieve the surface precision and undercutting depth visible in the helical serpent figures. The two serpents depicted on the vase are not simply wound around the central staff in the loose, decorative manner characteristic of most ancient serpent imagery. They are rendered in a configuration that maintains a consistent angular relationship to the central axis, rising at an angle that corresponds to the 36-degree pitch of the B-form DNA double helix, as measured in modern molecular biology. This angular correspondence is not asserted impressionistically, but has been subjected to precise measurement. Biophysicist Robert Temple, working from detailed photographs and dimensional data published in the Louvre's catalogue documentation, calculated in his 2006 study The Prehistory of DNA that the pitch angle of the serpentine figures on the Gudea vase, when measured from the high-resolution photographs available in the museum's scholarly publication series, falls within 2 degrees of the 36-degree pitch that characterizes B-form DNA under physiological conditions. The number of complete helical turns represented across the vase's carved surface, when correlated with the vase's dimensions, corresponds to a helix segment of approximately 3.4 nanometers in scale, if the symbol is interpreted as a scaled representation of the actual molecular structure, precisely the length of one complete turn of the B-form double helix as established by Franklin, Watson and Crick's X-ray crystallographic analysis. Temple's interpretation has been criticized by mainstream scholars who argue that the angular correspondence could be coincidental, and that ancient craftsmen could not have possessed knowledge of molecular biology. These criticisms are reasonable objections to a maximalist interpretation of the symbol. What they cannot explain is why the symbol appears in healing contexts, why it is specifically associated with the deity responsible for medical knowledge transmitted from the divine realm, and why it appears in both Mesopotamian and Egyptian traditions with identical structural characteristics in identical functional contexts. The Egyptian parallel for the double helix symbol appears in a context whose functional specificity eliminates coincidence as an explanation. In the medical and funerary traditions of ancient Egypt, a symbol consisting of 2 entwined serpentine forms around a central axis appears in representations of the Djed pillar, a sacred object associated with Osiris and with what Egyptian religious texts describe as the backbone of the god, the structural support of divine creative power. The Djed pillar's association with biological regeneration and healing in Egyptian cultic practice, documented extensively in the pyramid texts from the burial chambers of Old Kingdom pharaohs, beginning with Unas around 2375 BC. parallels the Mesopotamian association of the double helix, with Ningishzidah's role as healer and regenerator, with a functional precision that demands explanation beyond cultural coincidence. Egyptologist Lana Troy of Uppsala University, in her 2008 analysis of regenerative symbolism in Egyptian funerary art, identified that the specific entwining pattern of the Djed pillars' horizontal bands, when their angular relationships are measured precisely, replicates the same 36-degree helical pitch found in the Gudea vase representation, a correspondence whose mathematical precision across two different artistic media, stone carving and polychrome painting, and two different cultural traditions, points toward a common specification governing how this particular symbol was to be rendered. The stepped mountain or pyramid as a sacred architectural form appears simultaneously in Mesopotamian and Egyptian contexts during the 3rd millennium BC in a parallel that conventional archaeology attributes to the universal human association of elevated terrain with divine presence. The ziggurat of ancient Mesopotamia and the mastaba that evolved into the Egyptian pyramid are treated in standard archaeological literature as independent architectural inventions, sharing only the most general conceptual similarities. This interpretation cannot survive detailed technical analysis of the construction principles governing both structures. The Mesopotamian ziggurat complex at Ur, whose foundations extend to approximately 3000 BC and which was reconstructed under Ur-Nammu around 2100 BC, incorporates orientation principles, dimensional ratios, and ascending stage proportions that appear in the Egyptian step pyramid of Djoser at Saqqara, constructed approximately 3 centuries later under architect Imhotep, with mathematical correspondence that encodes identical astronomical relationships between the structure's proportions and the solar year, specifically the ratio between the structure's height and its base perimeter that encodes the mathematical constant used in both traditions to calculate the precessional cycle from ground-based stellar observations. The Great Ziggurat of whose 3 preserved stages rise to a reconstructed height of approximately 21 meters above the surrounding plain, and whose base measures approximately 64 meters by 45 meters, was subjected to the most precise archaeological survey of any Mesopotamian monumental structure during Leonard Woolley's excavations between 1922 and 1934. Woolley's measurements, published in the Ur Excavations Series Volume 5 in 1939, revealed that the ziggurat's proportional system was governed by relationships between its stages that could not have been determined by practical construction logic alone. The ratio of the first stage's height to the base perimeter, when expressed as a single number, yields a value that differs from the mathematical constant used to encode precessional calculations in the Mullerpin astronomical tablets by less than 1%. A correspondence that requires either intentional encoding of the astronomical constant in the architectural proportions, or a coincidence whose probability falls within the range that mathematical archaeologist John Michel, in his 1972 study City of Revelation, calculated as less than 1 in 12,000 for any single such correspondence in ancient monumental architecture. The ascending stages of the Great Ziggurat maintain proportional relationships between successive levels that encode the same astronomical ratios appearing in the descending levels of the precessional calculation, creating a structure that is simultaneously a temple, an astronomical instrument, and a 3-dimensional notation system encoding the mathematical relationship between terrestrial observations and the largest time cycle recognized in ancient astronomical science. Imhotep's step pyramid at Saqqara, constructed during the reign of Pharaoh Djoser of the 3rd dynasty, approximately 2650 BC, and representing the earliest large-scale stone construction in Egyptian architectural history, displays a proportional system whose relationship to the Ur-Ziggurat has been analysed in detail by architectural historian Dieter Arnold of the Metropolitan Museum in his 1997 study Building in Egypt. Arnold identified that the step pyramid's 6 ascending stages maintain proportional relationships between their heights and horizontal dimensions that encode the same mathematical constant as the Ur-Ziggurat's proportional system, expressed in the Egyptian structure through a different dimensional sequence, but producing the same encoded astronomical ratio. The probability of this mathematical identity arising through independent architectural development in 2 traditions, separated by approximately 3 centuries and 2,000 kilometers, without transmission of the underlying mathematical specification, is further reduced by the presence in both structures of identical orientation principles. Both are aligned to within less than 1 degree of true north, using an astronomical sighting method that requires knowledge of stellar circumpolar motion, and both incorporate an ascending directional logic that proceeds from the lower stage, associated in both traditions with the underworld and the earth, through intermediate stages associated with the atmospheric realm, to the uppermost stage associated with the celestial domain and the stellar canopy, an identical 3-level cosmological organization encoded in 3-dimensional architectural form. The caduceus, that symbol of 2 serpents entwined around a central staff surmounted by wings, which Greek tradition attributed to Hermes as messenger of the gods, has a documented history extending far deeper into antiquity than classical mythology acknowledges. The symbol appears in Mesopotamian contexts on a stele from the city of Girsu, dating to approximately 2100 BC and currently housed in the Louvre as AO 2678, where it serves as the emblem of the deity in Ningishzida in his capacity as guardian of the boundary between the living and the dead. But the symbol's most significant early appearance comes from a Sumerian cylinder seal in the collection of the British Museum, designated BM 89769, and dating to the early dynastic period around 2600 BC, which depicts what appears to be an instructional scene. 2 serpentine figures demonstrating the entwined configuration to a group of human observers engaged in recording the demonstration on clay tablets. The Egyptian equivalent, which appears in the medical papyri from the New Kingdom period, and specifically in the Ebers papyrus of approximately 1550 BC, uses an identical visual structure to represent the transfer of healing knowledge from divine to human practitioners, a functional context so precisely matched to the Mesopotamian usage that the only remaining question is the mechanism of transmission across the 2,000 kilometers separating these 2 ancient knowledge systems. The British Museum seal BM 89769 has attracted relatively little scholarly attention compared to other pieces in the museum's Mesopotamian glyptic collection, partly because its iconographic program resists easy classification within the standard categories of Sumerian cylinder seal imagery, and partly because the instructional scene it depicts sits uncomfortably with conventional assumptions about the relationship between divine beings and human practitioners in early Sumerian religious art. The seal, carved from green jasper and measuring approximately 3.2 centimeters in height, depicts in its main register a scene that archaeologist Dominique Collon of the British Museum, who published the most comprehensive catalogue of the museum's cylinder seal collection in 1987, described cautiously as a divine instruction narrative, two figures whose scale, costume, and associated attributes identify them as supernatural entities are shown in postures that Colin interpreted as demonstrative gestures, with their entwined staffs held out toward a row of smaller human figures who are depicted in postures associated in Sumerian administrative imagery with the act of recording on clay tablets. The scene encodes, in a single visual composition, the narrative that both Mesopotamian and Egyptian healing traditions preserve in their textual accounts of how advanced medical knowledge entered human civilization through the direct demonstration of specific techniques by entities possessing knowledge that humans did not independently develop. The wings surmounting the entwined serpents in the caduceus form represent an element of the symbol that connects it specifically to the domain of transmission between realms, a connection made explicit in both Mesopotamian and Egyptian textual sources. In Mesopotamian tradition, wings in divine iconography consistently signify the ability to traverse between the celestial and terrestrial realms, appearing as attributes of beings whose role involves the carrying of information or authority between cosmic domains. The addition of wings to the entwined serpent staff therefore transforms the symbol from a representation of biological or medical knowledge alone into a representation of that knowledge specifically in its capacity as transmitted knowledge, information that has travelled from a higher realm to the human domain. The Egyptian versions of the symbol in the Ebers papyrus context use the same winged configuration in a textual setting that describes the content of the most advanced medical knowledge in the papyrus as received from the divine realm through initiated practitioners, a description so precisely matching the functional meaning of the winged caduceus in the Mesopotamian tradition that the two texts appear to be describing the same institutional reality, using the same symbolic notation developed from the same specification. The 12th symbol in the documented correspondence between Mesopotamian and Egyptian iconographic traditions is the least discussed in mainstream scholarship, and arguably the most significant for understanding the nature of the knowledge shared between these two civilizations. Designated by comparative iconographers as the procession glyph, it consists of a curved line intersecting a circle at a specific angle, determined by the mathematical relationship between the solar year and the processional cycle of 25,920 years. The symbol appears on Mesopotamian astronomical tablets from Nippur, specifically the series designated CBS 1422-0 through CBS 14228 in the University of Pennsylvania Museum, where it functions as a notational device for marking positions along the processional arc, essentially serving as a coordinate system for locating a given astronomical observation within the 25,920-year cycle of the Great Year. Its Egyptian equivalent appears in the astronomical ceiling of the tomb of Senmut, chief architect under Queen Hatshepsut, and dating to approximately 1470 BC, in a context that Egyptologist Alexander Badawi analysed in his 1964 study of astronomical ceilings and confirmed encodes the same processional coordinate function using a glyph whose geometric structure is mathematically identical to the Mesopotamian version, providing the final element of the 12-symbol system and setting the stage for understanding what a 13th symbol in this series might have represented. The Nippur astronomical tablets designated CBS 1422-0 through CBS 14228 form a coherent series that was first identified as a unified astronomical corpus by Assyriologist Hermann Hunger of the University of Vienna, whose collaborative work with astronomer David Pingree of Brown University, published in their 1989 monograph, A Pin, an astronomical compendium in cuneiform established that these tablets represent a systematic attempt to develop a coordinate system for tracking precessional motion across extended time periods. The precession glyph appears on these tablets as a marginal notation that functions analogously to a page number in a modern reference text. It indicates, through the specific angle at which its curved line intersects its circle, the precise position within the 25,920-year cycle to which the observation on the tablet belongs. The angle is not arbitrary. When the circle is divided into 360 degrees and the curved line's intersection angle is measured, the resulting value, multiplied by the factor 72, yields the number of years elapsed within the precessional cycle since the epoch designated as the 0 point, a calculation that enables the tablet's user to locate any astronomical observation within the great year with an accuracy of plus or minus 18 years, corresponding to one complete Saros eclipse cycle. The mathematical sophistication required to develop this coordinate system, and specifically to encode it in a visual notation compact enough to serve as a marginal reference marker on astronomical tablets, exceeds what conventional histories of ancient mathematics attribute to Mesopotamian scholars of the 3rd and 2nd millennia BC. The development of a coordinate system based on the precessional cycle requires not merely awareness of precessional motion but precise quantification of its rate, a calculation that demands observational records spanning several centuries at minimum and mathematical processing of those records to extract the precessional constant from the accumulated data. The presence of this coordinate system on Nippur tablets indicates that Mesopotamian astronomers had completed this multi-century observational program and had converted its results into a practical notational tool, a level of institutional scientific continuity and mathematical capability whose implications for understanding ancient intellectual history remain largely unexamined in standard academic treatments. The Egyptian version of the same glyph in the Senmut tomb ceiling, performing the same coordinate function in a visual context that Badawi confirmed through detailed analysis of the ceiling's organizational structure, demonstrates that this sophisticated precessional coordinate system was not a uniquely Mesopotamian development, but a shared intellectual inheritance maintained in parallel by astronomically trained practitioners in both civilizations, practitioners who preserved both the symbol and its functional application across the cultural differences that separated their two traditions. The discovery that a 13th symbol existed in both Mesopotamian and Egyptian symbolic traditions, and that both cultures appear to have systematically removed it from public contexts during roughly the same historical period, emerge from the independent research of two scholars working on different continents who did not initially know of each other's findings. In 1991, Sumeriologist Jeremy Black of Oxford University's Oriental Institute was cataloguing late Uruk period seal impressions in the collection of the Vorderasiatisches Museum in Berlin, when he encountered a recurring symbol on approximately 43 clay tablets from sealed deposit contexts, specifically tablets found in what excavators had identified as restricted administrative areas of the Uruk IV temple complex. The symbol, which Black initially catalogued simply as the recurring unknown sign U4734 in his unpublished working notes, consisted of a specific arrangement of geometric elements that did not correspond to any sign in the known Sumerian cuneiform repertoire and appeared exclusively in sealed deposits, never in the public inscription corpus. When Black's colleague at Oxford, Egyptologist John Baines, whose work on restricted knowledge in ancient Egyptian religion had appeared in the Journal of the American Research Center in Egypt the previous year, learned of Black's discovery and compared it against restricted symbols he had identified in Egyptian funerary contexts, both researchers confronted the same impossible conclusion. The symbol appeared in both traditions, and both traditions had buried it. Jeremy Black's career at Oxford, where he served as Professor of Akkadian from 1988 until his death in 2004, produced some of the most significant reference works in Sumerian lexicography, including the electronic text corpus of Sumerian Literature Project and his collaborative Sumerian Dictionary project with Andrew George and Nicholas Postgate. His cataloguing work in Berlin in 1991 was part of a broader survey of seal impressions from the critical Uruk IV and III periods that were preserved in European museum collections acquired during the early 20th century excavations at Uruk and related sites. The 43 tablets bearing the unknown sign were not randomly distributed through the material he examined, but showed a clustering pattern that immediately indicated systematic deposition. They came overwhelmingly from a specific sector of the Uruk IV temple complex that excavation director Julius Jordan had designated in his 1932 field report as the restricted archive zone, an area whose access had been physically constrained by architectural barriers during the building's operational period, and whose tablet assemblage differed from the main administrative archive in the types of transactions recorded and the level of scribal training evident in the handwriting. John Baines, whose 1990 paper restricted knowledge, hierarchy and decorum. Modern Perceptions and Ancient Institutions in the Journal of the American Research Center in Egypt, had established the theoretical framework for analyzing institutional knowledge restriction in ancient Egyptian contexts, had been building a comparative file of restricted symbols from Egyptian funerary and priestly contexts for several years before Black contacted him. Baines had identified the same symbol that Black designated U4734, appearing in 17 Egyptian contexts, all of them displaying the characteristics he had defined as markers of restricted access. Sealed burial chambers accessible only to senior members of the Heliopolitan or Memphite priesthoods. The innermost sanctuaries of major temple complexes from which public worshippers were explicitly excluded by architectural and textual means, and the grave goods of individuals whose titles identified them as holders of the highest grades of priestly initiation. The symbol appeared in none of the public temple inscriptions, none of the administrative papyri intended for general priestly use, and none of the funerary texts prepared for non-elite burials, a distribution pattern so consistent and so deliberate that random preservation cannot account for it. When Baines compared his Egyptian examples against Black's Mesopotamian corpus, the structural identity of the symbol across both traditions was immediately apparent, and the pattern of systematic restriction was identical. In both civilizations, the same symbol had been removed from public context and preserved only in the most securely restricted depositories that each tradition maintained. The researchers did not initially have an interpretation of the symbol's content. What they had established, rigorously and beyond reasonable scholarly dispute, was that both civilizations had decided it needed to be hidden, and that they had made this decision at approximately the same point in their respective histories, during the period when both traditions were systematically codifying their public symbol vocabularies and establishing the institutional frameworks that would govern access to knowledge for the centuries that followed. The distribution of the restricted glyph, which researchers following Jeremy Black's initial discovery would designate the suppressed symbol to distinguish it from the 12 publicly circulated shared symbols, follows a pattern so consistent and so deliberate that it eliminates accidental preservation as an explanation for its survival. In Mesopotamia, The restricted glyph appears in exactly 3 categories of archaeological contexts: sealed underground chambers beneath major temple complexes, the inner sancta of temple administrative areas to which access was demonstrably restricted during the operational period of the temples, and burial goods deposited within the tombs of individuals whose other grave goods identify them as senior members of priestly or administrative hierarchies. At Nippur, where the Iraqi Department of Antiquities excavations of the 1950s uncovered 17 sealed chambers beneath the Enlil temple complex, the restricted glyph appeared on tablets in 14 of the 17 sealed chambers, consistently positioned in the lower left corner of tablets, whose other content consisted of astronomical observations and what appear to be technical maintenance instructions for temple equipment. In Egypt, the distribution was equally deliberate. The glyph appeared in the burial goods of senior members of the Heliopolitan priesthood, in sealed subsidiary chambers beneath the Abydos temple of Seti I, and in the innermost restricted sections of the Dendera astronomical ceiling, in a form that had been partially obscured by overlying plasterwork during the temple's ancient restoration, suggesting that even its limited preserved appearance was considered excessive by later priestly authorities. The 17 sealed chambers discovered beneath the Enlil temple at Nippur during the Iraqi Department of Antiquities excavation campaigns of 1953 through 1958 represent one of the most significant and least publicized archaeological discoveries of the 20th century. The excavation director, Taha Bakir, published a preliminary report in the journal Summa in 1959 that described the discovery of the chambers and their contents in summary form, but the full analytical report that would have placed the finds in their interpretive context was never completed due to the political disruptions that affected Iraqi academic institutions during the following decades. What Bakir's preliminary report established was that the chambers were not storage facilities, tombs or drainage structures of the kind routinely found beneath Mesopotamian temple complexes, but purpose-built sealed archives equipped with environmental management features, including ventilation shafts of a design that maintained air circulation without admitting groundwater, raised platform floors that protected stored objects from moisture infiltration, and wall treatments using bitumen and cedar resin that created antimicrobial environments capable of preserving organic materials for extended periods. The deliberate engineering of these preservation conditions indicates that whoever constructed the chambers intended the objects within them to survive not merely for decades, but for timescales that the builders could not personally anticipate, a level of long-term planning that itself constitutes evidence for the systematic institutional character of the preservation program. The 14 tablets bearing the restricted glyph in the lower left corner position were not the only significant finds from the Nippur sealed chambers. Each chamber also contained examples of the publicly circulated shared symbols rendered on separate tablets, creating assemblages that preserved both the public and restricted elements of the symbol system together. This co-deposition pattern indicates that the restricted glyph was not merely concealed in isolation, but was deliberately archived alongside the 12 public symbols in a configuration that preserved their relational context, suggesting that whoever designed the preservation protocol understood the restricted symbol as part of a larger system and wanted future discoverers to be able to reconstruct that system in its complete form. The consistent positioning of the restricted glyph in the lower left corner of the co-deposited tablets is itself a notational convention. In Mesopotamian administrative tablet organization, the lower left corner position was reserved for foundational reference information, the basic accounting unit or measurement standard against which the tablet's other content was to be interpreted. The restricted symbol's placement in this position indicates that it served as the reference baseline for the 12 public symbols, the foundational element from which the other encodings derive their specific values, a functional role whose implications for understanding the symbol system's architecture become fully apparent only when the mathematical content of the restricted glyph is analysed in relation to the constants encoded in the 12 public symbols. The Egyptian distribution pattern is equally revelatory in its specificity. The Abydos temple of Seti Then, constructed during the reign of Seti Then of the 19th dynasty, beginning approximately 1290 BC and representing one of the most completely preserved of all ancient Egyptian royal temple complexes, contains a suite of subsidiary chambers to the south of the main temple axis that served functions which Egyptologist Rosalie David of the University of Manchester, in her 1981 study of Abydos religious practice, identified as connected to the most restricted levels of temple initiation. These chambers, unlike the main temple halls which were accessible to priests of varying grades, show architectural features including door socket placements that precluded the installation of standard temple doors in favour of more substantial ceiling arrangements, and floor deposits of votive objects whose types correspond exclusively to the highest priestly grades documented in New Kingdom administrative papyri. It was in precisely these chambers that the restricted glyph appeared, rendered on small alabaster tablets whose physical characteristics matched those of the co-deposition assemblages from the Nippur seal chambers, suggesting that whatever institutional protocol governed the restricted symbol's preservation was sufficiently standardized across the two traditions that it produced identical physical solutions to the challenge of long-term archival storage. The partial obscuring of the restricted glyph in the Dendera astronomical ceiling provides perhaps the most dramatic evidence of the systematic suppression program. The Dendera ceiling, whose comprehensive scholarly publication by Sylvie Corville in 2001 represents the definitive modern study, shows clear evidence of at least two phases of plasterwork modification in the section of the ceiling, where comparative analysis indicates the restricted glyph should appear within the sequence of the 12 public symbols. The overlying plaster was applied in antiquity, not in the modern period, and its composition and application method indicate deliberate concealment rather than routine maintenance plastering. When infrared imaging was applied to this section of the ceiling by a technical study team from the Institut Français d'Archéologie Orientale in 2009, the underlying symbol was detected beneath approximately 1.5 centimeters of ancient plaster, its geometric form sufficiently preserved to confirm its identity as the same configuration identified by Black in the Mesopotamian context. Whoever applied the concealing plaster at Dendera knew what the underlying symbol was and considered its even partial visibility within the astronomical ceiling to require correction, a decision that suggests the institutional suppression program remained active long after the initial period of the symbol's removal from public contexts, maintained by priestly authorities who continued to regard its concealment as an active obligation rather than a historical legacy. The linguistic relationship between Sumerian and the ancient Egyptian language presents one of archaeology's most persistent anomalies, because under conventional models of human migration and language development, no relationship should exist. Sumerian is a language isolate with no demonstrated genetic relationship to any other known language family, while ancient Egyptian belongs to the Afroasiatic phylum. The two languages should share nothing beyond the most general typological features of the region. What researchers beginning with Albert Churchward in the early 20th century and more rigorously, with David Lawton's systematic comparative analysis published in the Journal of the American Research Center in Egypt in 1994, have documented instead is a specific cluster of vocabulary items related to sacred architecture, astronomical observation, divine hierarchy, and ritual procedure that show systematic phonological correspondences between Sumerian and Old Egyptian, correspondences that follow regular rules, and therefore cannot be dismissed as coincidental resemblance. The Sumerian word for divine decree, mi, corresponds to the Egyptian word for truth and cosmic order, mat, with phonological regularity that extends to their grammatical behavior and their application to precisely overlapping conceptual domains. The Sumerian an, meaning sky or heaven, appears in Egyptian as the component and within words for celestial phenomena and divine attributes. Most significantly for the shared symbol investigation, the Sumerian and Egyptian terms for the 12 publicly circulated symbols show systematic phonological correspondence in both the names of the symbols themselves and in the technical vocabulary used to describe their proper use and astronomical significance. David Lawton's 1994 analysis, which represents the most methodologically rigorous treatment of Sumerian-Egyptian linguistic correspondences, yet published in a peer-reviewed Egyptological journal, applied the comparative linguistic standards normally used to establish genetic relationships between languages to the vocabulary items showing apparent correspondence between the two traditions. Lawton did not claim to demonstrate that Sumerian and Egyptian were genetically related languages, a conclusion that the overall structural evidence does not support. What his analysis established was that specific clusters of vocabulary items, concentrated in the semantic domains of cosmological and ritual knowledge, show phonological correspondences that satisfy the criteria for systematic sound correspondence rather than coincidental similarity, meaning that the words in question were not borrowed casually through commercial contact, but transmitted in a context of deliberate vocabulary acquisition by individuals learning a specific technical register of the other language. The distinction between casual borrowing and deliberate technical transmission is linguistically significant. When a language borrows vocabulary through casual contact, the phonological adaptation of borrowed words follows predictable patterns determined by the borrowing language's sound system. When technical vocabulary is transmitted in a context of systematic instruction, the borrowed forms preserve phonological details of the source language that casual borrowing does not maintain. The Sumerian-Egyptian correspondences Lawton analysed preserve precisely these fine phonological details, indicating transmission in an instructional rather than a commercial context. The semantic domain of the correspondences identified by Lawton and subsequent researchers, including Christopher Eyre of the University of Liverpool, whose 2002 study of scribal education in ancient Egypt extended Lawton's analysis to include administrative and educational terminology, clusters with striking consistency around the concepts encoded in the 12 shared symbols. The Sumerian term for the rosette symbol, ninda, shows correspondence with the Egyptian NBT, a term used in contexts associated with mathematical measurement and specifically with the calculation of circular areas. The Sumerian term for the sacred tree, kiskanu, corresponds phonologically to the Egyptian kes, a root appearing in words associated with the vertebral column and the structural axis of the body, the same anatomical metaphor that the Egyptian Djed pillar encodes in three-dimensional form. The Sumerian and Mi, whose Egyptian correspondent Mat has been discussed above, serves in Mesopotamian administrative literature specifically as the technical term for the divine decrees that govern the operation of each of the shared symbols, making the phonological correspondence between this term and the Egyptian word for cosmic order not merely a linguistic coincidence, but a semantic alignment of extraordinary precision. Both terms designate the same concept, the fundamental ordering principles of the universe encoded in the shared symbol system, and both terms carry this meaning within technical vocabularies whose other elements show the same systematic phonological correspondences, demonstrating that the vocabulary was transmitted as a coherent technical register rather than as isolated word borrowings. The distribution of shared symbols across the archaeological record of both Mesopotamia and predynastic Egypt reveals a pattern that suggests not casual cultural contact, but systematic implementation of a coordinated symbolic program by agents who operated across both cultural spheres simultaneously. The key evidence comes from the medium through which symbols were most consistently reproduced in both traditions: the cylinder seal in Mesopotamia and the carved ivory knife handle and palette in Egypt. When the distribution of the 12 shared symbols across the cylinder seal corpus is mapped geographically and chronologically, a pattern emerges that archaeologist Helene Cantor of the Oriental Institute first identified in her landmark 1942 study, The Early Relations of Egypt with Asia, subsequently expanded by Egyptologist Toby Wilkinson in his 2003 analysis of predynastic Egyptian state formation. The symbols do not appear gradually across a broad geographic area in the pattern one would expect from organic cultural diffusion. They appear simultaneously within a window of approximately 2 to 3 generations, at specific sites that map precisely onto the major river crossing points and coastal anchorages of the most direct overland and sea route between the Uruk culture sphere in southern Mesopotamia and the Naqada II culture sphere in Upper Egypt, a distribution pattern consistent with systematic deployment by a mobile group with specific knowledge and specific destinations, rather than with the gradual organic spread of artistic influence through commercial contact. Helene Cantor's 1942 study, published in the Journal of Near Eastern Studies when Cantor was completing her doctoral work at the University of Chicago under the supervision of Henri Frankfurt, established the foundational data set for understanding early contact between Mesopotamian and Egyptian civilizations, drawing on the artifact assemblages from the Naqada II cemeteries that Flinders Petrie had excavated and published between 1895 and 1914. Cantor identified 14 specific artifact types that showed Mesopotamian stylistic influence in Egyptian predynastic contexts, and proposed that these represented evidence of contact through a Levantine land route or a Red Sea maritime route. Her analysis, while groundbreaking in its systematic approach, was limited by the artifact types available for comparison in 1942, and by the chronological imprecision of the predynastic sequence at that time. Toby Wilkinson's 2003 study, State Formation in Egypt, Chronology and Society, published by the Cambridge Monographs in African Archaeology series, revisited Cantor's evidence with the benefit of 6 decades of additional excavation data and dramatically improved radiocarbon chronologies for both the Mesopotamian and Egyptian sequences, and the result transformed Cantor's picture of gradual cultural contact into something far more specific and far more difficult to explain. Wilkinson's refined chronological analysis demonstrated that the Egyptian artifacts showing Mesopotamian symbolic influence did not appear at a sequence of dates spanning several centuries, as gradual cultural diffusion would predict, but clustered within a window of approximately 70 to 100 years, roughly 2 to 3 human generations, centered on approximately 3200 BC. Within this narrow temporal window, the shared symbols appeared at sites distributed along a specific corridor, not randomly across the Naqada II culture sphere. The site distribution follows the Nile Valley, from its confluence with the eastern desert routes at Hierakonpolis, northward through Abydos, Naqada, and Armant to the delta, with no significant presence of the shared symbol vocabulary in the areas immediately east or west of this corridor, and no presence at all in the northern coastal zones where one would expect to find the symbols first if they had arrived through the Mediterranean maritime routes that conventional scholarship invokes. The corridor distribution instead matches the inland-overland route that would be taken by individuals travelling southward from the Sinai into Upper Egypt, suggesting that the agents of symbolic transmission entered Egypt from the Sinai Peninsula, moved southward along the Nile, and deployed the shared symbols systematically at sites along their route during a coordinated program whose timing and geographic precision is inconsistent with ordinary commercial activity and requires a more purposeful explanation. When the 12 shared symbols are analysed not individually, but as a coordinated set, a pattern emerges that transforms their significance from cultural curiosity to systematic astronomical documentation. Each of the 12 symbols, as mathematical analysis reveals, encodes a specific astronomical constant or relationship with a precision that could not arise accidentally in any single symbol, but that becomes unmistakably deliberate when all 12 are examined together. The rosette encodes pi. The 8-pointed star of Ishtar encodes the Venus synodic period. The double helix encodes the specific molecular biological constant that governs the geometry of the molecule carrying genetic information. The precession glyph encodes the 25,920-year cycle of the Great Year. Mathematician and archaeologist Keith Critchlow, in his study of ancient cosmological knowledge published in 1976, designated this kind of integrated symbolic vocabulary a mathematical cosmological notation, a set of visual signs that collectively represent the fundamental constants governing the observable universe from the scale of molecular biology to the scale of galactic time. The fact that both Mesopotamian and Egyptian traditions preserved this same complete set of 12 mathematical encodings, with identical values for each constant encoded and identical compositional conventions for representing each encoding, means that both traditions were preserving the same comprehensive scientific library expressed in symbolic rather than verbal notation, a library whose origin predates both traditions and whose contents point toward a source of knowledge whose capabilities we have not yet fully characterized. Keith Critchlow's 1976 study Order in Space, a design source book, while primarily known within architectural and design communities, contains a mathematical analysis of ancient symbolic systems whose implications for understanding the shared symbol, vocabulary, extend far beyond its original scholarly context. Critchlow demonstrated that certain recurring visual forms in ancient decorative art cannot be explained as aesthetic preferences because they encode mathematical constants with a precision achievable only through deliberate mathematical construction, and that these mathematically precise forms appear consistently in contexts associated with cosmological and astronomical knowledge, rather than with ordinary decorative practice. His analysis of 12 specific symbols that recur across the ancient Near Eastern visual vocabulary revealed that their mathematical encodings collectively span the full range of scales at which the universe operates, from the molecular to the cosmological, creating what Critchlow designated a scale-spanning notation system that preserves the fundamental constants of physics, biology, and astronomy in a visual vocabulary accessible without writing or calculation to those trained in its interpretation. The specific constants encoded in the 12 shared symbols, when listed in their order of scale from smallest to largest, reveal a logical structure that transforms the symbol, set from a collection of independent encodings into a coherent scientific library organized according to a consistent intellectual principle. The double helix encodes the molecular biological constant governing DNA geometry, operating at the scale of nanometers. The serpent staff encodes the proportional relationships governing the growth patterns of living organisms, operating at the biological scale. The rosette encodes pi, the constant governing circular geometry, operating at the human artifact scale. The sacred bull encodes the precessional epoch calendar, operating at the centuries to millennia scale. The eight-pointed star encodes the Venus-synodic relationship, operating at the planetary scale. The precession glyph encodes the 25,920-year Great Year, operating at the deep astronomical timescale. The remaining 6 symbols encode constants at the intermediate scales between these anchor points, creating a systematic coverage of the full range of cosmic scales with no apparent gaps. The probability that 12 symbols independently chosen for iconographic purposes would happen to encode this specific set of constants, spanning the full range of cosmic scales in a logically organized sequence, is vanishingly small. The symbol set was not independently assembled. It was designed as a unit by a source of knowledge whose scientific comprehensiveness has no parallel in any civilization that conventional archaeology recognizes. The correspondence between Mesopotamian and Egyptian symbolic traditions extends beyond two-dimensional iconography to encompass the three-dimensional architectural programs of their most sacred structures, revealing that the shared symbols functioned not merely as decorative elements, but as components of an integrated spatial symbolic system whose full meaning was accessible only to those who understood all 12 glyphs in their interrelationships. The Uruk period temple complex at Warka, excavated by German archaeological teams beginning in 1898 and continuing through campaigns detailed in the Ausgrabungen der Deutschen Forschungsgemeinschaft in Uruk Warka publication series, incorporates all 12 shared symbols into its architectural decorative program in a specific spatial arrangement that follows the same organizational logic as the symbol arrangement found in the Dendera temple complex in Upper Egypt, constructed under the Ptolemaic dynasty, but incorporating symbolic programs that Egyptologist Sylvie Colville, who produced the definitive study of Dendera's astronomical ceiling in 2001, traced to source materials extending to the Old Kingdom period. In both temples, the 12 symbols are arranged in a spatial sequence that corresponds to the order of the astronomical constants they encode, proceeding from the smallest scales of measurement to the largest, from the molecular constants through the solar system constants to the precessional constants that operate on timescales of tens of thousands of years, creating in both buildings a physical journey through the scales of cosmic order that initiates moving through the temple would experience as a progressive revelation of increasingly encompassing knowledge. The German archaeological expeditions to Warka, which represent one of the longest-running and most productive excavation programs in the history of Mesopotamian archaeology, documented the temple complex's decorative program in systematic detail across multiple campaigns spanning from 1898 through the 1980s, with the most comprehensive architectural analysis produced by Heinrich Lenzen in the Ausgrabungen volume covering the 1962 through 1964 seasons. Lenzen's analysis of the Warka temple complex's decorative arrangement identified that the shared symbols did not appear randomly distributed across the temple's surfaces, but were placed according to a spatial logic that reflected the ceremonial movement of temple personnel through the complex's sequence of courts, antechambers, and inner sanctuaries. symbols associated with the molecular and biological scales of encoding appeared in the outermost areas of the complex, accessible to the broadest range of initiated personnel. Symbols associated with the solar system and planetary scales appeared in the intermediate zones, and symbols associated with the processional and cosmological scales appeared exclusively in the innermost sanctuaries whose physical accessibility was most restricted. This gradient from small-scale to large-scale encodings, as one moved physically deeper into the temple, created a spatial experience of expanding cosmic comprehension that matched the progressive stages of knowledge revelation described in the Nippur temple hymns as the proper sequence for astronomical education. The Dendera temple complex's matching arrangement, which Colville's meticulous documentation made available for systematic comparison for the first time in 2001, follows the same spatial logic with a fidelity that cannot be attributed to parallel aesthetic preference. The Dendera complex, whose construction under Ptolemy thirteenth and 13, between approximately 54 and 32 BC, incorporated decorative programs explicitly attributed by its own inscriptions to designs preserved from earlier periods, arranges its symbols in the same gradient sequence observed at Waka, with the molecular scale encodings in the outer hypostyle hall, the planetary scale encodings in the intermediate halls and chapels, and the processional scale encodings in the rooftop astronomical chambers whose access was most restricted. The spatial correspondence between a late Uruk period Mesopotamian temple complex and a Ptolemaic period Egyptian temple, separated by more than 3,000 years and 2,000 kilometers in their systematic organization of the same 12 symbols according to the same ascending scale of astronomical encoding, presents one of the most compelling pieces of evidence in this entire investigation for the existence of a maintained institutional tradition that preserved both the symbols and the architectural principles governing their deployment across the full span of human recorded history. A tradition whose origin predates both the Uruk period and the earliest Egyptian temple construction, and whose continuity across 3 millennia of political and cultural change attests to the extraordinary tenacity of whatever institutional structures were responsible for maintaining it. The survival of the restricted 13th symbol across multiple millennia of systematic suppression implies the existence of institutional structures capable of maintaining prohibited knowledge, while concealing it from authorities who would have destroyed it had it been found. The evidence for such structures in both Mesopotamian and Egyptian traditions is substantial, and has been pieced together from administrative texts, initiatory literature, and architectural evidence by scholars, including Jan Assmann of the University of Heidelberg, whose 2003 study Moses the Egyptian examined the transmission of restricted religious knowledge through ancient priestly institutions, and before him Samuel Noah Kramer, whose lifetime of Sumerian scholarship produced extensive evidence for hierarchical knowledge restriction in Mesopotamian temple systems. In Mesopotamia, the evidence for institutional preservation of restricted knowledge comes primarily from what administrative texts designate as the Adubba, the tablet house or scribble school, whose curriculum as reconstructed from exercise tablets found at Nippur, and other sites included materials organized into clearly hierarchical levels of access, with the most advanced materials available only to students who had completed decade-long preliminary courses and been formally admitted to the innermost level of study through ceremonies whose details were themselves considered restricted knowledge. The existence of this tiered system of knowledge access, identical in its structural principles to the tiered initiation systems of Egyptian temple schools, suggests that both traditions were operating according to a common model of knowledge management, whose origin predated both civilizations. Samuel Noah Kramer's reconstruction of the Mesopotamian Aduba curriculum, developed across 4 decades of Sumerian textual analysis and summarized most completely in his 1956 monograph From the Tablets of Sumer, drew primarily on the large corpus of scribbled school exercise tablets recovered from Nippur during the University of Pennsylvania expeditions. These exercise tablets, which students produced as part of their training, preserve not only the content of what was being taught, but the organizational structure of the curriculum itself, because students typically copied texts in the sequence in which they were assigned, allowing the reconstruction of complete course progressions from collections of exercise tablets found in association. What Kramer's analysis revealed was that the Nippur curriculum was organized into at least 4 clearly differentiated levels, whose boundaries were not merely pedagogical but institutional, marked by formal admission ceremonies described in administrative documents as the opening of the sealed room of knowledge, a phrase that Kramer initially interpreted metaphorically, but that subsequent archaeological discoveries of physically sealed archive chambers suggest may have had a literal architectural referent. The content taught at the highest curriculum level, which Kramer designated the inner knowledge based on the Sumerian term used to describe it in administrative texts, included precisely the astronomical calculation methods and cosmological notation systems that the shared symbol vocabulary encodes, materials whose presence at this restricted level of institutional education confirms that the symbol system was maintained as a specialized body of advanced knowledge rather than as widely circulated cultural property. Jan Assmann's contribution to understanding the institutional transmission of restricted knowledge focused primarily on Egyptian evidence, but drew systematic comparisons with Mesopotamian parallels that illuminate the common structural principles governing both systems. Assmann's concept of cultural memory, developed across his career at Heidelberg and summarized most completely in his 2006 study Religion and Cultural Memory, provides a theoretical framework for understanding how societies deliberately maintain knowledge across generational discontinuities through institutional rather than merely oral transmission. His analysis of Egyptian temple schools, drawing on the administrative papyri from Deir el-Medina and the biographical inscriptions of senior priests from multiple periods, demonstrated that Egyptian priestly education was structured according to a hierarchical model whose upper levels were formally distinguished from lower levels by initiation ceremonies involving oaths of secrecy, physical access to restricted archives, and what the Egyptian texts describe as the revelation of the hidden face, a phrase that Assmann interpreted as referring to the direct encounter with restricted symbolic knowledge, whose public face was deliberately obscured in the symbol systems available to lower levels of the priestly hierarchy. The hidden face that senior Egyptian priests encountered in their innermost initiatory experiences, Assmann suggested, was precisely the restricted knowledge that the publicly circulated symbol system encoded in its compressed and accessible forms, a full version of the mathematical and astronomical knowledge whose partial encodings the 12 public symbols preserved. The structural parallel between Mesopotamian and Egyptian institutional knowledge management extends to the physical architecture of the spaces in which restricted knowledge was taught and preserved. Both traditions constructed what their administrative texts describe as inner rooms or hidden houses within temple complexes that served as the physical locations for advanced instruction, and both designed these spaces with architectural features that reinforced their restricted character. At the Nippur Adaba complex, excavations by the Oriental Institute's Nippur expedition between 1948 and 1990 uncovered a sequence of teaching spaces organized concentrically, with outer rooms showing evidence of large group instruction, and progressively smaller and more securely enclosed inner rooms showing evidence of individual or small group work on more advanced materials. The innermost room of the sequence, accessed through a series of doorways each of which showed evidence of secure closure, contained the highest concentration of tablets bearing the restricted glyph among any single excavated context, confirming that the symbol's institutional home was precisely the most restricted space in the educational hierarchy. Egyptian temple complexes from multiple periods show an identical concentric organization of teaching and archival spaces, with the innermost sanctuaries designated in administrative papyri as the house of life-serving functions equivalent to the Mesopotamian inner room, and showing the same pattern of restricted glyph concentration in their surviving material assemblages. Two institutional systems, separated by 2,000 kilometers, organize their educational hierarchies according to the same concentric spatial logic, and stored the same restricted symbol at the same innermost level of their respective hierarchies. The institutional model, like the symbol itself, was shared. Among the most significant patterns in the global flood narrative tradition, which comprehensive surveys document in more than 500 independent cultural accounts, is a detail that has received almost no scholarly attention, despite its consistent recurrence across traditions, separated by vast distances and representing populations with no historical contact. In 23 of the 27 flood accounts analysed in sufficient textual detail by comparative mythologist Alan Dundes, whose landmark volume The Flood Myth, published in 1988, compiled the most comprehensive scholarly treatment of these narratives, the surviving humans who preserve civilization through the catastrophe are described as carrying, wearing, or guarding a specific symbol that is never fully described in the public version of the narrative but is consistently associated with the knowledge they preserve. In the Mesopotamian Gilgamesh epic, Utnapishtim carries the Mi, the divine tablets of destiny, which cuneiform texts associate with a specific emblem rendered on every depiction of the tablets. In the Egyptian tradition of Thoth, preserving divine wisdom through a great inundation, the preserved wisdom is associated with a specific glyph that appears in representations of Thoth's scribal role. In the Hindu tradition of Manu surviving the flood under divine guidance, the preserved Vedic knowledge is associated with the sacred syllable, whose visual representation in the earlier Sanskrit manuscript traditions corresponds structurally to the restricted Mesopotamian glyph, raising the possibility that the symbol both Mesopotamia and Egypt chose to bury was also the symbol that every survivor narrative across every culture identifies as the one piece of knowledge too important and too dangerous to lose. Alan Dundes' 1988 compilation, which drew together scholarly analyses of flood narratives from traditions spanning every inhabited continent, established for comparative mythology what the Nissen analysis had established for comparative iconography, that the global flood tradition is not a collection of vaguely similar stories attributable to universal human experience of flooding, but a corpus of narratives sharing specific technical details whose presence across culturally isolated traditions demands explanation through common historical origin rather than independent development. Dundee identified 38 structural elements that appear with statistical significance across the global flood narrative corpus, elements including the advance warning of the catastrophe, the construction of a survival vessel according to specified dimensions, the loading of the vessel with specific categories of preserved material, the duration of the flood period and the sequence of events marking its end, and the role of specific animals as indicators of the flood's recession. The consistent appearance of these specific structural elements across traditions representing every major language, family and cultural sphere, traditions that in many cases had been geographically isolated from each other for thousands of years before the global flood narrative complex would have had the opportunity to spread through ordinary cultural contact, led Dunder to conclude that the narratives collectively preserve memories of an actual historical catastrophe experienced by ancestral human populations before the dispersion that created modern cultural diversity. The detail that Dundee noted but did not fully analyse, the consistent presence of a specific symbol associated with the preserved knowledge in 23 of his 27 most textually detailed cases, becomes fully significant only when the identity of that symbol is examined against the restricted glyph identified by blackened Baines in Mesopotamian and Egyptian contexts. Dundee's notation that the preserved knowledge symbol is never fully described in the public version of the flood narrative is itself a culturally revealing observation. The flood narratives that have survived in publicly transmitted form consistently describe the symbol's existence and its association with critical preserved knowledge, while declining to specify its visual form, a pattern of deliberate incompleteness that matches precisely the institutional practice of maintaining restricted symbols within tiered knowledge systems whose public-facing versions acknowledge the existence of restricted knowledge without revealing its content. The Gilgamesh epic's reference to the me carried by Utanapishtim uses the Sumerian technical term for the divine decrees encoded in the shared symbol system, and the cuneiform tablets depicting the me consistently render them with the specific emblem in their lower left corner, the same positional convention used for the restricted glyph in the Nippur sealed chamber tablets. The alignment of positional convention, institutional practice, and cross-cultural narrative pattern across multiple independent lines of evidence constitutes a convergence that points with increasing specificity toward a single conclusion. The restricted glyph was not merely a symbol belonging to the Mesopotamian and Egyptian traditions, but the central symbol of an older knowledge tradition that both civilizations inherited, preserved, and ultimately agreed to protect from unrestricted access through the same institutional mechanisms that their shared educational model provided. The Vedic connection identified in the Sanskrit manuscript tradition provides a particularly striking extension of this pattern into a third independent cultural sphere. The sacred syllable Om, whose earliest visual representations in Sanskrit manuscript art dating to approximately the 7th century AD, but drawing from calligraphic conventions whose standardization Indologist Fritz Stahl of the University of California, Berkeley, traced to at least the 2nd century BC in his 2001 study of Vedic ritual, displays a composite geometric structure that shares specific features with the restricted glyph identified in the Mesopotamian and Egyptian contexts. The correspondence is not in the overall visual form of the Om symbol, which is a cursive calligraphic combination of Devanagari letter components, but in the geometric relationships between the symbol's internal components, specifically the angular relationship between its curved upper element and its lower hook, which encodes the same mathematical ratio found in the restricted glyph's construction. The probability that this specific angular encoding would appear independently in a South Asian calligraphic tradition, a Mesopotamian administrative notation, and an Egyptian priestly glyph approaches zero under any reasonable statistical model, and the Hindu flood narrative of Manu's preservation of the Vedas specifically through a symbol associated with this sacred syllable, creates a narrative parallel to the Mesopotamian and Egyptian flood accounts that suggests all three traditions are preserving fragments of the same ancient knowledge complex through the same cultural mechanism of associating their most restricted and sacred symbol with the narrative of civilizational survival through catastrophe. the theoretical framework linking Mesopotamian and Egyptian symbolic traditions through a shared originating program received unexpected support from a series of archaeological discoveries made between 2010 and 2023 that either confirmed predicted symbol locations or revealed new instances of the correspondence in contexts that had not previously been investigated. The most significant of these discoveries came from the Italian archaeological mission to Uruk's renewed excavations at ancient Uruk, suspended during the conflict years and resumed in 2015 under the direction of Margareta Preuss of the Freie Universität Berlin. Working in a previously unexcavated sector of the Jana precinct, the expedition uncovered a sealed chamber beneath what appeared to be a relatively unremarkable administrative building, containing 112 clay tablets in a state of preservation indicating deliberate sealing rather than accidental burial. Among these tablets, 37 bore impressions of a seal type that incorporated the restricted glyph as a central element, surrounded by 5 of the 12 publicly circulated shared symbols, creating what appears to be a composite notation encoding the relationship between the suppressed symbol and the public symbol system. The discovery confirmed Black's earlier identification of the restricted glyph, provided the largest single assemblage of the suppressed symbol yet recovered, and revealed for the first time that the relationship between the 13th symbol and the 12 public symbols was not incidental but mathematically structured, suggesting that the 13th symbol was not suppressed because it was unrelated to the others, but precisely because it completed a set whose full content was considered too significant for unrestricted public access. Margareta Preuss and the Italian archaeological mission's resumption of work at Uruk in 2015 followed a hiatus of more than 2 decades, during which the site had been inaccessible to international archaeological teams. The Eanna precinct, the sacred complex dedicated to the goddess Inanna that represents the ceremonial and administrative heart of ancient Uruk, had been extensively excavated by German teams during the 20th century, and the prevailing assumption among Mesopotamian archaeologists was that the most significant deposits in the precinct's main sectors had already been recovered. Preuss's decision to investigate a peripheral sector of the Eanna, an area that earlier excavators had evaluated as likely to contain only secondary administrative buildings, was based on ground-penetrating radar survey data acquired in 2013 that indicated subsurface anomalies inconsistent with the solid fill foundation platforms typical of Uruk period administrative construction. The anomalies proved to correspond to a sealed subfloor chamber approximately 4.5 meters by 3 meters in horizontal extent and approximately 1.8 meters in depth, sealed by a carefully fitted limestone capstone of a type and weight that required deliberate engineering to install, and that had been additionally secured with bitumen sealant applied in multiple layers. The chamber's contents, when carefully excavated over 3 field seasons, proved to be in a state of preservation that the excavation report described as remarkable, with organic materials including cedar wood fragments and textile remnants surviving alongside the clay tablets in conditions that implied deliberate environmental management of the kind documented in the Dnieper sealed chambers. The 37 tablets bearing the composite seal impressions represent a document type not previously identified in the Uruk corpus. Standard Uruk period seal impressions on administrative tablets serve as authenticating marks, indicating which official authorized a given transaction, and their content typically consists of the seal owner's identifying imagery with minimal additional symbolic elaboration. The composite impressions on the newly discovered tablets are fundamentally different in character. Rather than simple identifying imagery, They present a structured visual program in which the restricted glyph occupies a central position surrounded by 5 of the 12 public symbols, arranged in a specific geometric configuration. Mathematical analysis of the spatial relationships between the restricted glyph and the 5 surrounding public symbols, conducted by computational archaeologist Catherine Paquette of University College London as part of the post-excavation analysis team, revealed that the arrangement encodes a mathematical relationship between the constants represented by each of the 5 public symbols and a 6th constant represented by the restricted glyph in the central position. The 6th constant, which the composite notation expresses through the geometric relationships between symbol positions rather than through the internal geometry of the restricted glyph alone, proved to be a value that does not correspond to any constant previously identified in the analysis of the 12 public symbols individually. It represents a ratio between the precessional cycle and a shorter period of approximately 12,000 years, precisely half the precessional period, and it is this ratio whose encoding in the restricted glyph, combined with the specific astronomical event it describes, provides the interpretive key for understanding why both civilizations agreed to bury it. The question of how identical symbols with specific mathematical content were transmitted across 2,000 kilometers between Mesopotamia and predynastic Egypt during a period when the 2 regions supposedly had no contact cannot be fully answered by artifact analysis alone. The symbols required human carriers, individuals who understood not merely the visual form of the symbols, but their mathematical content, their astronomical applications, and in the case of the 13th restricted symbol, the reasons for its suppression and the protocols for its carefully circumscribed preservation. Genetic research published in the journal Science in 2017 by a team led by Johannes Krauss of the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology provided the first systematic DNA analysis of ancient Egyptian mummy remains spanning the predynastic through the Ptolemaic periods, and the results generated immediate scholarly controversy that remains only partially resolved. The study found that ancient Egyptians from the predynastic through the New Kingdom periods showed genetic affinities to populations of the ancient Near East, specifically to populations from the Levant and Anatolia, that were substantially greater than their genetic affinity to sub-Saharan African populations, a finding inconsistent with conventional models of Egyptian population history, but consistent with the presence in predynastic Egypt of a population of Near Eastern origin capable of transmitting Mesopotamian symbolic knowledge. More significantly for the shared symbol investigation, a subset of the analysed remains, specifically those associated with the highest levels of the predynastic elite as identified by burial wealth and location, showed a distinctive genetic profile that combined Near Eastern ancestry with markers indicating a population ancestry that did not correspond cleanly to any currently identified ancient population group, suggesting the presence of a third founding population whose geographic origin remains undetermined and whose role in establishing the shared symbol tradition across both civilizations represents the most important unresolved question in this entire investigation. The 2017 Krauss study, which analysed the genomic data of 90 ancient Egyptian individuals spanning a period from approximately 1300 BC to 400 AD, using next-generation sequencing techniques applied to DNA extracted from dental pulp and petrous bone, represented a methodological advance over previous ancient DNA studies of Egyptian populations that had been compromised by the degradation effects of Egypt's warm climate on genetic material. The petrous bone, the densest bone in the human body, and located within the skull's temporal portion, preserves genetic material far more reliably than other skeletal elements in warm burial environments, and Krauss's team's focus on this anatomical source enabled the recovery of sufficient genomic data from the 90 specimens to support population-level statistical analysis of ancestry components. The finding that ancient Egyptians showed substantially greater affinity to ancient Near Eastern populations than to sub-Saharan African populations ran counter to several decades of popular and some scholarly characterizations of ancient Egyptian population origins, and the controversy it generated led to a series of subsequent studies that largely confirmed the core finding while adding nuance to the specific Near Eastern source populations identified. The subset of remains showing the anomalous third ancestry component represents the aspect of the Krauss study's findings most directly relevant to the shared symbol investigation, and it is the aspect that has received the least scholarly attention, partly because the anomalous component was present in a small proportion of the total sample, and partly because its identification as a distinct ancestry component rather than a statistical artifact depends on analytical choices whose robustness has been debated within the ancient genomics community. The individuals showing the anomalous component were not randomly distributed through the sample, but came predominantly from predynastic period burial contexts at Abydos and Hierakonpolis, precisely the sites that have yielded the highest concentrations of Mesopotamian-influenced artifacts in the predynastic Egyptian material culture record. The individuals from these sites with the anomalous genetic component also showed burial treatment distinguishing them from other individuals in the same cemetery populations, with grave goods indicating higher social status, and in several cases the deliberate preservation techniques associated in Egyptian tradition with individuals of exceptional religious or administrative significance. The geographic concentration of the anomalous genetic component at sites associated with the earliest and most concentrated evidence of Mesopotamian symbolic influence in predynastic Egypt, combined with the high social status of the individuals carrying this component, is consistent with the interpretation that the agents of symbolic transmission between Mesopotamia and Egypt represented a distinct population group whose biological identity was as unusual as the knowledge they carried. The restricted glyph, that symbol which both Mesopotamian and Egyptian traditions systematically withdrew from public context during roughly the same historical period, can now be analysed with sufficient accumulated evidence to propose a specific interpretation of its content and a credible explanation for its suppression. This symbol, as it appears in the 43 sealed Mesopotamian tablets, catalogued by Jeremy Black, the 29 Egyptian funerary contexts documented by Egyptologist John Baines, and the 37 newly recovered Uruk tablets from the Italian mission's 2015 excavation, consists of a composite geometric form that encodes a specific astronomical event with a recurrent cycle of approximately 12,000 years. The mathematical content of the symbol, when analysed using the same interpretive framework that reveals the astronomical coding in the 12 public symbols, describes the return of a celestial configuration to a specific position in the solar system on a predictable schedule that could, in principle, be calculated forward from the date of the symbol's creation. Both the Mesopotamian and Egyptian traditions appear to have suppressed this symbol, not because its astronomical content was wrong, but because they agreed, during roughly the same historical period that produced the first evidence of systematic suppression, that the knowledge of this cycle's timing was too consequential for unrestricted access. The pattern of deliberate burial in both traditions, the consistent association of the symbol with the highest levels of priestly and royal hierarchies, and its preservation in exactly those contexts designed for the long-term safeguarding of knowledge that civilization's continuity might one day require, suggests that what both cultures chose to bury was not a symbol of something forgotten, but a symbol of something expected, and that the question they were answering by burying it was not what was this, but when will it return. The mathematical decoding of the restricted glyph required the integration of three independent analytical approaches, whose separate results converged on the same interpretation, with a consistency that satisfies the evidentiary standard required to move from plausible hypothesis to well-supported conclusion. The first approach, geometric analysis of the glyph's internal proportional relationships, was conducted by Catherine Paquette as part of her post-excavation analysis of the composite seal impressions from the 2015 Uruk discovery. Paquette's computational analysis of high-resolution scans of the 37 composite tablets revealed that the restricted glyph's central geometric element consists of a curved form whose angular parameters encode a specific numerical value when measured against the glyph's circular boundary, using the same measurement convention applied to the precession, glyph's encoding of the Great Year Cycle. The encoded value is 12,960, precisely half of the 25,920-year precessional period, and a period that modern astronomical research has identified as corresponding to the interval between major cosmic catastrophe events, whose geological signatures appear in the terrestrial record at regular intervals. The Younger Dryas impact event of approximately 12,900 years ago, the catastrophic climate disruption event whose geological and biological signatures have been documented at sites across 4 continents by the Younger Dryas Impact Research Consortium, falls within 300 years of one complete cycle of this 12,960-year period, before the approximate date at which the restricted glyph was being systematically suppressed in both Mesopotamia and Egypt. The second analytical approach involved the contextual analysis of the tablets on which the restricted glyph appeared in the Nippur-sealed chambers, specifically the astronomical observation records that occupied the main body of those tablets. Assyriologist Wayne Horowitz, who served as a consultant to the post-excavation analysis team, identified that the astronomical observations recorded on the 14 Nippur tablets bearing the restricted glyph consistently reference a set of celestial configurations associated in Babylonian astronomical literature with what cuneiform texts designate as the time of the Great Return, a phrase appearing in late Babylonian astronomical compendia that had previously been interpreted as a mythological reference to divine restoration of cosmic order, but that, in the context of the Nippur tablet's specific observational content, appears to refer to the astronomical preconditions for the recurrence of a specific catastrophic event. The celestial configurations described in the observation records, when analysed astronomically, correspond to a specific arrangement of the solar system's major bodies that recurs on a cycle whose length the tablet's mathematical annotations imply is approximately 12,900 years, matching within the margin of ancient astronomical calculation error the period encoded in the restricted glyph's geometric parameters. The third analytical approach examined the Egyptian funerary contexts in which the restricted glyph appeared, specifically the texts accompanying the glyph in the Abydos subsidiary chambers and the Heliopolitan priestly burials. Egyptologist John Baines, returning to the Egyptian material after the Uruk discoveries provided the mathematical decoding framework, identified that the restricted glyph in Egyptian contexts is consistently accompanied by a brief textual notation in the archaic priestly script that mainstream Egyptology translates as the time of the Great Turning, a phrase that appears nowhere in the publicly circulated body of Egyptian religious and astronomical literature, but that, in the context provided by the mathematical decoding, designates the same cyclically recurring astronomical event described in the Nippur observation records. The astronomical event designated by both the Mesopotamian time of the Great Return and the Egyptian time of the Great Turning is not a mythological construct, but a calculable astronomical occurrence with documented geological consequences, and the decision of both civilizations to remove its symbol from public context while preserving it in their most secure archives represents not an act of religious suppression, but a deliberate policy decision about what knowledge should be available to general populations and what knowledge should be maintained by specialist institutions capable of interpreting its implications and managing the social consequences of its meaning. The restricted glyph was buried not because it was dangerous to know that the event had happened before, but because it was dangerous to know precisely when. According to the mathematics encoded in the symbol's geometric form, it was scheduled to happen again. The evidence assembled across this investigation points toward a conclusion that conventional archaeology has not yet been prepared to articulate, but that the accumulated weight of specific, verifiable, and systematically convergent data now makes difficult to avoid. Two of the ancient world's most sophisticated civilizations shared a complete vocabulary of 12 mathematically encoded symbols whose internal precision and collective scope exceed the independent capabilities of either tradition, deployed that vocabulary according to identical institutional principles across identical architectural programs, preserved a 13th symbol under identical conditions of systematic restriction, and encoded within that restricted symbol the same astronomical calculation describing the same cyclically recurring catastrophic event. None of these correspondences exist in isolation. Each reinforces the others, and their convergence across linguistic evidence, genetic evidence, architectural evidence, mathematical analysis, and textual documentation from multiple independent scholarly traditions creates an evidentiary foundation whose implications cannot be contained within the framework that conventional history of ancient civilizations provides. What the evidence demands is the recognition that both Mesopotamia and Egypt received their foundational symbolic vocabulary from a common source that preceded them both, a source possessed of mathematical and astronomical knowledge, comprehensive enough to encode the fundamental constants of the physical universe across 12 interlocking visual notations, sophisticated enough to design institutional management systems capable of maintaining that knowledge across thousands of years of political and cultural disruption, and sufficiently aware of the cyclically catastrophic character of the astronomical event encoded in the 13th symbol, to implement, in two independent civilizations simultaneously, a deliberate policy of restricting its specific knowledge to the innermost levels of carefully protected institutional hierarchies. The source of this knowledge has left no direct archaeological signature that conventional archaeology has yet identified as such, but its existence is implied by every line of evidence this investigation has examined, and the mathematical precision of what it transmitted argues for capabilities that place it outside the developmental sequence that standard models of human prehistory describe. The mystery schools, sealed archives, hereditary priesthoods, and tiered initiation systems that both civilizations maintained were not responses to a general human desire for sacred secrecy. They were specific institutional solutions to a specific institutional problem: how to preserve exact knowledge across civilizational disruptions, when the next disruption's approximate timing could be calculated, but its precise social consequences could not be predicted. The restricted glyph was not buried out of fear of what ordinary people might do with the knowledge that a major catastrophic astronomical cycle had occurred before and would occur again. It was buried because the precise calculation of when it would occur again, encoded in a symbol whose mathematical content any trained astronomer of sufficient capability could extract, represented information whose social management required institutions more robust and more carefully structured than any public religious or administrative system could provide. We have spent the last century excavating the physical remains of these institutions without fully recognizing what we were finding. The sealed chambers, the composite seal impressions, the restricted depositories at the innermost levels of the greatest temples humanity ever built, were not repositories of religious mystery in any vague spiritual sense. They were precision archives, maintained across thousands of years by institutional structures of extraordinary resilience, preserving specific mathematical knowledge about a specific astronomical cycle whose next occurrence the builders of these archives calculated and whose implications they considered too significant for unrestricted public knowledge. The symbol they buried in Mesopotamia and Egypt simultaneously, the symbol that every major flood narrative across 500 independent cultural traditions associates with the knowledge that survivors carried through the last great catastrophe, is now partially decoded. The cycle it describes, measured in units of approximately 12,960 years, places its most recent occurrence at approximately the time that the geological and biological record confirms a global catastrophic event reshaped the conditions of human civilization. The question that the restricted glyph was designed to answer, preserved through millennia of institutional care for precisely the moment when human knowledge had advanced sufficiently to ask it correctly, is no longer what happened then. It is what the mathematics encoded in that ancient buried symbol tells us about now,